All right, good afternoon and welcome everyone to the Judicial Proceedings Committee. Today will mark the first of several briefings that we're going to host on all aspects of the juvenile justice system, or many aspects of the juvenile justice system. And so today we are joined by several distinguished guests who are, I see at the table, we've got Secretary Schiraldi, who will kick us off today, and will be followed by the Office of Public Defender, who's here as well, and then we'll hear from the state's attorneys. Tomorrow, we are going to have another briefing on the medical aspects of the justice system, and with a specific eye toward juvenile justice. But we'll have folks from shock trauma. We'll have Dr. Scalia come in from shock trauma, Daniel Webster, and some other folks that do social work that follow the continuum of care for folks that have been victims of gun violence and look into the contributing factors there. The next day, we'll have a briefing on chronic absenteeism and truancy. And so we'll hear from MSDE, MSEA, Attendance Works, and several other folks that do work in this area to give us some understanding of what's happening with regard to chronic absenteeism and truancy, and if there is a nexus with justice-involved individuals who are not in school. Then we'll follow up and we'll have a briefing from the Council of State Governments that will give us a deep dive in terms of trend analysis for violent crime in Maryland, with a specific eye toward juvenile crime. So we'll have kind of an independent validator of information come in to tie a bow on all of this this entire week. So today, I really do want to say thank you to all the guests that have come here. I know you've come before the House Judiciary Committee. This is a little bit more of a truncated schedule, focused on just the high level functioning. How does the juvenile justice system function? Where do you perceive to be complications or points of failure? And then specific recommendations as how we can improve. I know that several folks that are going to testify are also going to provide us with some trend analysis, some numbers for intake, for instance, how many juveniles you see. And then we'll hear from the state's attorneys to see from their perspective what the challenges are. And hopefully we can come out of this with a list of recommendations and some semblance of ground truth as to what's actually happening out there. Because I think a lot of the members here, I'll speak for myself, don't have a clear-eyed window into how things actually function on the ground, and what the real ground truth is in terms of what's actually happening out there. So we read a lot of headlines, but I tend to say this, that the trend lines are very important as well. And the trend lines are important for long-term strategic lawmaking and policy development. But the headlines are telling you what's happening right now and what's top of mind for folks out there who we represent. So with that backdrop, Mr. Secretary, I'd like to invite you up to the podium and say, again, thank you for your time, and the floor is yours. Each group will have 30 minutes, and then we are going to do Q&A at the end of their collective presentations. So with that, Mr. Secretary, the floor is yours. Thank you. Is
that good? Great. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Vinny Schiraldi. I am Secretary of the Department of Juvenile Services. I want to thank you for having me kick off a series of briefings on youth justice with presentations by these various stakeholders. As Governor Moore has said, it's going to take an all-of-government approach in partnership with the community to build solutions to address public safety. Before I go to the next slide, I'd like to say that it's my goal at DJS to hold young people accountable and help them get on a better path in life, all in order for residents of Maryland to be and feel safer in their communities. People have a right to feel safe in their home communities, full stop. And that's what my team and I devote our time and energy to every day. So today I'd like to discuss the history and background of the juvenile justice system, an overview of our role in the juvenile justice system, and some of the challenges and plans for improving our conditions and outcomes in juvenile justice. So the juvenile justice system was founded in the 1800s because the people of the time, the leaders of that time, believed that young people weren't just smaller versions of adults, but they were actually different than adults in two important ways that mattered from the standpoint of jurisprudence. One is that young people are more malleable and therefore still able to change and mature. The person at 16 is not the same person as they are at 30 in ways that are different than the person at 30 is different from the person at 40. Very substantial difference between teenagers and young adults versus adults and older adults. And second, that young people are less culpable than adults. Not that they're not culpable at all, just that they're less culpable, and if they're dealt with appropriately, they'll grow out of their delinquency. The system remained focused on rehabilitative goals until the 1980s and the 1990s. In the 90s, coinciding with an increase in homicides by both adults and juveniles, particularly with firearms, we started to hear young people being called super predators, slogans like, if you do the adult crime, you do the adult time. And this kind of language and approach had an impact on public policy. Every state during the 1990s passed laws to make the system more punitive and to make it easier to imprison young people with adults, and that included Maryland. Nationally, the impact of those laws changes resulted in 109,000 young people incarcerated in juvenile facilities at its peak, and over 10,000 youth going to sleep in adult prisons and jails by right around 1999. And these are numbers that were unheard of by our own and international standards. This punitive turn wasn't felt equally by all young people, with youth of color, particularly Black youth, locked up at highly disproportionate rates, even for similar crimes and with similar prior records. Here in Maryland, 90% of the young people who enter our prisons before the age of 18 are youth of color. I want to note that unfortunately, we're seeing some of the same types of vilification going on about young people today, especially youth of color, and particularly by some media outlets. This creates an environment which is ripe for bad public policy decisions like happened in the 90s, which I think we just need to be very careful about and mindful as we go forward and decide what changes are being made. In response to many of the law changes enacted in the 1990s, the scientific community conducted research funded by the Justice Department and the MacArthur Foundation to see if youth really were different than adults. And they found that basically what every teenager's parent knows, that young people are actually different, particularly in ways that matter for the legal system. Researchers found that youth are more volatile in emotionally charged settings, not in non-emotionally charged settings, by the way, just in emotionally charged settings, more susceptible to peer influence. And when I say peer influence, that's good and bad, right? That's the negative stuff that kids do when they're together, but it's also why we put them on football teams and in chess clubs. And what's the last one? Oh, and they're less future oriented. They see things in much shorter time frames. That's why you can have a perfectly lucid conversation with your 16-year-old son about the philosophy class they're taking in high school, and then them and their buddies can go out and do something that's inexplicable. This brain science research sparked an era of innovation, prompting practices that have helped kids learn how to control their volatility through techniques like cognitive behavioral therapy, and also just building on young people's strengths like any of us want for our own kids: employment, education, service to their communities. States around the country began relying less on adult and juvenile incarceration, with every state, and that's what this shows, these are national data, with every state reducing the number of kids in custody right alongside substantial reductions in crime. That's what these two charts show right in front of you. That happened similarly in Maryland. The previous administration saw reductions in incarceration and closed 5 of our juvenile facilities. Contrary to causing a crime wave, this reduction in youth incarceration was accompanied by a 65% reduction in youth arrests nationally. Again, similar declines here in Maryland. And while we've seen an uptick in certain offenses since the pandemic, juvenile crime rates are still much lower than they were a decade ago and still lower than they were pre-pandemic. Again, people still don't feel that. I get that. I've been to some very tough public hearings and public meetings. And if you're afraid to walk around your own neighborhood, that's real. Even if the data doesn't support that, doesn't matter, right? I'm not trying to say that the people's feelings are illegitimate. I'm just trying to give you the data because that's what you asked for. So now the next slide, I'm going to walk you through our role in the juvenile justice process. There's often misunderstandings about the department's role, and I hope that by going through these decision points, it'll provide more clarity, not again to make any kinds of excuses or to negate the way people are feeling. So I'm starting with intake. Like legislatures have done around the country, the Maryland General Assembly, have given the Department of Juvenile Services the ability to divert certain young people from formal system involvement. But you've put in several checks and balances on our decision-making. Diversion is an important tool. It allows young people to be held accountable and linked to services without formal court involvement. Importantly, for them to get those services more quickly without having to wait for the adjudicatory process to occur. Also, research consistently shows that when appropriate youth are diverted, they get rearrested less frequently than when their cases are handled formally. Put another way, when low-level youth go into the system, they tend to have worse outcomes than if they were diverted from the system. DJS by law is required to send every complaint that alleges a young person engaged in a violent felony or a handgun offense to the state's attorney. DJS is prohibited from diverting these cases unless the state's attorney approves those actions after their review. For example, that means from the standpoint of formalizing cases, meaning sending them forward for prosecution, the state's attorney decides what to do with all carjacking, armed robbery, or other violent offenses. We do have the ability to divert misdemeanor and non-violent felonies. However, the law does not allow this decision to be made in a vacuum. The law requires us to notify the victim, the arresting police officer, and the person or agency making the complaint whenever we divert a case. If they disagree with the decision, they can appeal that denial to the state's attorney's office. To help us identify risk and needs of the youth and make decisions about what to do with the complaint, we use an independently validated tool. Independently validated tools are invaluable because it means you can trust what the tool is telling you. Doesn't mean it's going to get it right 100% of the time. It just is guiding you in the right direction. Every few years, the tool is revalidated. The juvenile justice reform law that you all passed last year codified our already existing, actually in 2022, codified our already existing practice and requires that we work with the University of Maryland to conduct the revalidation of the tool. The university reviews our outcome data to make sure the tool is still accurately predicting youth's risks and needs. We are actually in the process of undergoing a new validation assessment right now. The results of the tool and a conversation with the victim, our staff determines if it's in the best interest of the youth and public safety to divert or forward the case to the state's attorney's office, again, in nonviolent cases. Some diversion services include teen court, community conferencing, multisystemic therapy, functional family therapy, behavioral health services, mentoring, and victims awareness classes. If the youth isn't successful in participating in the services, the department can forward the case to the state's attorney. So I'd like to give you one quick example. Let's imagine we receive a complaint from a school resource officer for your youth arrested for a misdemeanor, second-degree assault stemming from a school fight. The caseworker then talks to the victim. After reviewing the tool and seeing the youth is low risk, the caseworker asks if all the parties would like to participate in community conferencing. That's where you bring everybody together, talk about what happened in the case, and try to come up with a resolution. If everyone agrees, the case manager will work with the service provider, make sure that the community conference actually happens and that everyone participates. If it does, then the case can be resolved without forwarding it to the state's attorney's office. If the youth does not participate in the conference, the department can still forward the case to the state's attorney. We have a very high success rate for youth who are diverted. 92% of the cases diverted had no sustained offenses within 1 year. Next, I'm going to talk about detention. There are times when a youth is arrested and the police request that the youth be detained. They don't always request that the youth be detained, by the way, but there are times when they do. We then have the authority to determine what happens to that youth overnight, just till the next day. After interviewing the youth and their family and using the detention risk assessment instrument, which is different than the one we use for diversion, that's another validated tool, we have basically three options at that point. One is to release the youth to a parent or family member. This does not mean that the youth's involvement in the court system stops. They'll continue through intake, the intake process that I described earlier. It's just a pretrial release mechanism like it would be for an adult who either bails out or gets released on their own recognizance. That's one. Two, the youth can be put on an alternative to detention. That could be community detention, where one of our people checks on them, community detention with electronic monitoring, where one of our people checks on them, but they also have an electronic monitor on, or participation in an evening reporting center. That's a program that picks youth up after school or all day during the summer, provides them with activities during their free time, and returns them home to their parents when their parents return from work. 95% of the kids on our community detention with electronic monitoring program have no new charges while they're on CDEM. And then the third option, of course, is to detain the youth. Our policy is to detain all youth charged with the most serious crimes of violence, with possession of handguns, or kids that score high risk on the risk assessment instrument. So now the next day, the court reviews the youth placed either on the alternatives to detention or actually in detention. So either one of those come back. If the kid just goes home, then they set a date whenever they set a date. But if the kid's either on a detention alternative or actually detained, the court then sees them the next day, and the court has basically the same options. They can release the kid, they release them with an alternative, or they can detain him. We operate 5 detention centers: Baltimore City, Cheltenham, Western Maryland, Lower Eastern Shore, and Charles Hickey School in Baltimore County. Our detention population, as you can see from this chart, has changed dramatically during the past 10 years. Over half of the population in our detention centers are youth who are automatically tried as adults. That's the yellow figure on the chart. Youth charged as adults wait an average of 4 months in our detention center, which is in stark contrast to the average of about 21 days that youth going through the juvenile system wait. So it's considerably longer if you're being charged as adults, just because well, first of all, it's very serious. So the stakes are a lot higher. But second of all, and everybody else on these panels knows more about this next part than I do. But I think that the speedy trial timeframes are different for adults than juveniles. We have in Maryland one of the nation's highest rates of incarcerating young people in our adult prisons. In fact, we're 4th highest in the country. About 4% of prison populations nationally are made up of people who come in as juveniles. In Maryland, it's 8%. According to the Juvenile Justice Reform Council that several of you were on, that issued its findings 2 years ago, nearly 9 out of 10 of those youth who are automatically tried as adults either have their cases dismissed or transferred back to the jurisdiction of the juvenile court, or are sentenced to time served after waiting for that 4 months. When the youth are transferred back to us after 4 months, their cases often start all over again because it's a whole new court system, adding even more dead time to their stay. Okay, if a young person goes through the formal court process, they have an adjudicatory hearing, which is similar to a trial for an adult, but without the right to a jury. This is where the court determines if a youth is guilty. In the juvenile justice system, that's referred to as if facts are sustained, or not guilty, which is facts not sustained. If a youth is found involved, then the court has a disposition hearing, which is like a sentencing, where the court determines what's the best treatment option for the youth. At the hearing, we make a treatment recommendation for the court. We conduct assessments to determine the strengths, risks, and needs of the youth. The information is then used to tailor our recommendations for interventions and services. The court is the one who makes the ultimate decision if a youth will be placed on probation or in an out-of-home placement. If the kid's placed in an out-of-home placement, the court then also decides when the kid is able to leave that placement. Youth of color are also overrepresented in Maryland's detention and commitment facilities, and underrepresented in community-based approaches like diversion and probation. Here's the next slide. When a youth is placed out of home, we provide case management services. This involves monitoring the progress of each youth, coordinating services, and ensuring that the appropriate interventions are in place to address the youth's needs. We provide updates to the court about the youth's progress in treatment. We inform the court when the young person has completed their treatment goals, but we do not have the authority to release the young person. We operate 3 committed programs: Backbone and Greenridge in Western Maryland, and Victor Cullen near Hagerstown, north of Hagerstown, Sabilisville. When I came on board last year, the juvenile justice monitoring reports I reviewed were highlighting many troubling issues in our facilities, including an increase in incidents and use of restraints. And the JJMU also noted that girls were not placed in gender-appropriate care. So I immediately began to address those things by doing a couple of things. One is we just launched a new treatment program in July that uses evidence-based treatment, a form of cognitive behavioral therapy shown to reduce recidivism as its foundational framework. Just going back to what I said before, young people are more impulsive. We all can remember that from being young. Cognitive behavioral therapy can actually teach these young people to stop and think before they misbehave. And there's good evidence to show that if you practice that, you actually do it better than if you don't practice that. Reducing idle time by launching after-school programs. The kids were sitting around playing Spades and Xbox when I walked through the facilities. There's still more idle time than I'd like there to be, but at least there are after-school programs, and we literally pull the after-school programs from lots of school systems in the state, and we just, sort of implemented a bunch of them with both the juvenile service educational program staff and my own staff, some of whom decided they wanted to run some after-school programs. We reduced the staff vacancy rates in the facility significantly. It's down from 18% in January of 2023 to 8% in December of 2023. We launched off-grounds outings and trips for youth, including service trips, as well as an off-grounds work program for kids with the Department of Natural Resources and the Department of the Environment, if they've earned the right to go out into the community under supervision. And then finally, we moved all the girls into one facility, and we're increasingly training staff on gender responsive care for the girls. The girls previously were in several facilities. We also use a bunch of contracted residential programs that are located across the state. Some are out of state. These play a crucial role in offering a range of services to fulfill the diverse needs of our youth. Providers can operate group homes, residential treatment facilities, or other secure and non-secure settings, and we work closely with them to implement individualized treatment plans for the young people. One gap I identified early on, I went on a bunch of listening tours, talked to judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, was that there was literally no residential drug treatment program for young people in the state of Maryland for adolescents. This despite the fact that we're having this spike in opioid and fentanyl use. So I've been in discussions with Secretary Herrera Scott, who indicated that she will be opening a residential drug treatment facility in Maryland this year, which is going to be a big deal because I think sometimes kids get sent to us even when what they need is residential drug treatment. So we track the outcomes again on how youth do when they're treated in out-of-home placements. 85% of the youth released from one of our committed programs had no new sustained juvenile offense or adult convictions within a year. It's a good number. We expect this data to improve as we implement that new evidence-based treatment program I mentioned earlier. Okay, when a court orders a youth onto probation, we're responsible for ensuring that the conditions set by the court are followed. Case managers connect young people to court-ordered services, conduct regular check-ins, monitor their compliance with court orders, and provide them with support. We connect youth to counseling, mentoring, family therapy, educational support, vocational training, and other resources aimed at addressing the underlying issues that contribute to the young person's involvement with the justice system. We contract with providers across the state and refer kids to the programs that exist in communities or are provided by our sister agencies like local health departments. We have a great relationship with ROCA. Their relentless outreach from working with high-risk youth who are hard to engage has shown some very positive outcomes. When I got here, I learned that ROCA was unable to go into the detention facilities to talk to the kids before they came out. So I remedied that so that ROCA can actually start and get a relationship with the kid before they show up on the street. We also have exceptionally good working relationships with mentoring programs like Choice and the Youth Advocate programs. We've added several more, which I'll talk about later, as well as multisystemic therapy, family functional therapy, and family-centered treatment, all evidence-based programs, those three. And these are great programs, and they're critical to our community continuum. During my listening tour, I heard about the lack of programs specifically in Western Maryland and on the Eastern Shore, as well as no specific programming for youth involved in gun violence, which is obviously of great concern to many Marylanders, and we'll hear more about that shortly. All right, so I'd like to end my presentation by talking about the challenges the department faced when I arrived and what I've done to address those challenges and still am doing. First, during the prior administration, in response to the significant reduction in the population of youth arrested that I mentioned earlier, and arrested, detained, and committed to out-of-home placement, DJS closed 5 state-operated secure facilities and reduced spending on contracted out-of-home placements. Unfortunately, instead of using those cost savings to invest and increase the availability of funding for services in the community, the prior administration returned more than $100 million in savings to the general fund over the last decade. So now we're kind of digging out of that hole. We have both fewer community services and fewer residential facilities. We're working on a 2-pronged approach to enhance the service continuum. First, in the short term, the department's quickly identifying gaps in the service continuum and ways to fill those gaps. Additionally, we're identifying ways to work with local management boards to fund programs that fill identified service gaps in the various different counties throughout the state. The second is a community investment initiative partnership we'll launch this year with the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services and the Department of Human Services. Together, we're working to identify shared clients in neighborhoods in Maryland with the highest concentration of those shared clients amongst the 3 departments. And then what we're going to do is we're going to work with the community in those neighborhoods to bring resources into those neighborhoods to kind of collaboratively design how to achieve safety in those highly impacted neighborhoods. This way, we will no longer serve kids in isolation, but rather we'll work to help youth, families, and communities to be healthier and safer. Second, to rebuild relationships with community organizations, court system stakeholders, and law enforcement agencies. The deterioration of these relationships led to key partners not trusting each other, meaning there's significant work to do in order to build trust among stakeholders and effectively serve youth. To address this, the department has strengthened that partnership with system stakeholders and community groups. Outreach has included initial meetings by me and other top DJS leadership with judges, prosecutors, and defenders in 20 counties across the state to share more about our role in the system. We're regularly meeting with system stakeholders in each county to problem solve and address challenges they raise. Next, the prior administration didn't properly implement the juvenile justice reform legislation. One-time outreach to stakeholders was completed. However, there was really no follow-up or continued training, leading to a lot of confusion about the law. Police and court systems were not engaged in how to address children in need of supervision cases. Internal data systems weren't designed or updated to track and measure the success of the implementation. Confusion about the new law and the department's own missteps in implementation eroded the trust from system stakeholders. To address these concerns, the department launched a series of meetings educating police and stakeholders on the department's actions on a SINS referral. We did this in every county, and we did it twice in every county. So we brought together law enforcement, educators, social service, and parents. We also put up on our website information about how to file a SINS case. Those meetings are going to happen again this year, every quarter. So we're going to go back to every single county every quarter because you just got to say it over and over again. Since we started doing this, the number of youth under 13, which was predominantly affected by the change in the law, served by the department through SINS referrals, increased more than 7-fold, and rearrests have declined for youth under 13 by more than half, down from 34% in fiscal year 22 to 13% in fiscal year 23. Finally, the department had no focus on gun violence. During the pandemic, the number of youth who were victims of non-fatal shootings increased from 76 in 2019 to 171 in 2022. Addressing gun violence is paramount to creating a safe environment for our youth. The absence of a dedicated approach to curbing gun-related offenses perpetuates a dangerous environment, putting both the community and the young people themselves at risk. We didn't used to provide any specific interventions to youth who are at the highest risk of gun involvement, and we just changed that, which is what my next slide talks about. So the Thrive Academy is the first program in the country where a juvenile justice agency is applying a group violence reduction strategy specifically focused on youth in the juvenile justice system. So what we did first was we took 30,000 case files of kids together with the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform and the Casey Foundation, the Annie Casey Foundation. We analyzed those cases to see if we could tease out what separates the kids involved in gun violence from the kids not involved in gun violence. So 2% of that 30,000 were involved in gun violence, 98% were not. So what separates the two? We use those data as a way to do an initial screen on the kids on our caseloads, first in Baltimore City and Baltimore County. This month it'll be Prince George's County. Next month it'll be Anne Arundel County. We'll do the whole state by the end of the year. By the way, just those 4 jurisdictions, that's 85% of the victimization of young people in the state of Maryland. So then once we then have a sort of initial screen, we meet with law enforcement, we meet with prosecutors, we meet with public defenders, we meet with community members to say who on this list is really in danger. Sometimes some kid's best friend has been shot. That bumps them up on a list because everybody knows that kid's going to be angry about that and may take that gun he's used in the past and use it again. So that's the kind of information we're looking for from law enforcement, or there may be a hit out on some kid, all sorts of stuff that we just would never know all by ourselves. Once we have that, then we sit down with the young person and their family and we offer them entrance into the Thrive Academy. We have a respectful conversation with them, explaining the ramifications of gun violence, which is you could go to prison, you could get shot, somebody else could get shot, basically. And then it's not just a lecture. We then say, all right, but if you join us, we have a whole bunch of resources we can use to help you matriculate away from gun violence. We call that a suitcase for success. Every kid is hooked up with a life coach from a nonprofit organization. Often these are people who have been trained, but who have also walked in their shoes, who themselves had trouble with the law. That life coach and our specialized case managers have the ability to provide stipend of employment with local employers or paid service opportunities, along with coaching and support during employment, because some of the kids have never had employment before and they just need that help. Assistance with attending college or vocational training, again, along with some support. Confidential relocation assistance will move the kid and their family if they're in danger. Trauma therapy. I've yet to meet a kid involved in serious gun violence who has not themselves witnessed some unspeakable violence. And then opportunities for pro-social activities like camping, museum tours, civil rights tours, and finally, fiscal incentives for participation and for achieving agreed upon milestones. As I said, we launched in Baltimore City and County in September. I think I already said this. Life coaching partner organizations are We Are Us in Baltimore, Continuous Growth in Baltimore County, the Credible Messenger Mentoring Center in Prince George's County, and Glimpse of Paradise in Anne Arundel County. These are all grassroots organizations with a lot of knowledge about what's going on in their communities. That's my last slide. I'd like to conclude by saying that I'm committed to continue to work to ensure that we're providing services to youth and ensure their success, because we're all working towards the same goal of strong, safe, and cohesive communities. Everybody's got a right to be safe in their communities. We're focused like a laser on doing our part with the young people referred to us to make that happen. Thank you for your time today, and I look forward to working with you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. As we mentioned, we're going to wait until the completion of all of the briefings, presentations, and then we'll take questions at the end, but I'm sure you'll have a number of questions that are forthcoming. So thank you very much, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you.
Next, we will hear from distinguished public defender, Natasha Dartig, and is Miss Seegers, you coming on up? All right, excellent. Sandy will get you queued up and we can get underway.
I'm sorry. Yep, you're good. That's good. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, Chairman Smith and distinguished members of the committee. I am Natasha Darty, Maryland State Public Defender. I will today address with you key points in policy, and Attorney C. Gears, juvenile defender with the Office of the Public Defender, will address key points in practice. Our main focus today in addressing each of you is to highlight the importance of keeping children and communities safe. Our agenda will include a brief overview of the Public Defender's Office. We'll discuss communities and children and the need for investment and services, both in the communities and with children, JJRA, with an example of life of a case, as well as viable solutions. The Maryland Office of the Public Defender operates in 12 districts. Our central headquarters is in Baltimore City. We have a total of 52 offices throughout the state, essentially in each geographical district of the state of Maryland. As you can see, our districts are divided. Some districts are singular, others have multiple counties in them. We have juvenile defenders throughout the state of Maryland representing our children. I also highlight to you that our mission is strongly rooted in justice, fairness, and dignity for all. In addition to our 12 districts and 52 offices throughout the state, we have 11 specialty litigation divisions. And they are outlined here. The ones that are highlighted also work closely with our juvenile defenders, as well as our attorneys who represent our children who are charged as adults. I highlight our forensics division when you think about issues in terms of technology or DNA, our Innocence Project Clinic, when you think about cases where children have been charged, served a sentence of 20 years and come back for modification, juvenile protection, when children are removed from their homes and placed in various programs, both in the state and outside of the state, we continue to monitor to make sure that they are in fact being treated well and that they're receiving the services that are intended for them. We also have our mental health division, our parental defense division. I highlight parental defense because they work to keep our families together. We know that the greatest chance for success is when the family unit is remain whole. Our parental defense unit works with our families, especially those who face losing their children. And of course, a strong component in all our division are our social workers. Maryland's children deserve better. And what we do know for a fact is that incarceration hurts our children. Maryland has had a long problematic reliance on system involvement and carceral responses. Prevention strategies are what will be key to keeping both our children and our communities safe. Incarceration is punishment. When we talk about accountability, we must speak in terms of restorative justice. When children are held accountable, they are able to take full responsibility for their behavior. And what does that actually mean? Understanding how their behavior affects others, acknowledging that the behavior resulted from a choice that could have been made differently, acknowledging to all that were affected, including the victims, that their behavior was harmful, as well as taking action to repair the harm where possible. These are where, when we talk about accountability, these are the points that are necessary when we talk about behaviors, especially about children. We also must talk about offering children services and offering family support so that we can promote this type of accountability, not simply incarceration. We also know that children who are detained reoffend at a rate of 33% for felony offenses and 11% for misdemeanor offenses. So what are the strategies to prevention? And essentially, these are the critical care components. It's comprised of health, education, and community. OPD strongly believes that a public health approach is the solution. Now, for years, the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health has promoted looking at crime through a lens of public health. Specifically, in a 2006 study that looked to the rising dropout problem, and they determined that that could be resolved with prevention and intervention. In 2023, Hopkins Everyone Graduates Center encouraged the recruitment of about 187,000 adult tutors, mentors, and peer leaders in collaboration with the Biden administration to address the dropout issue at its source. This part of the solution is strongly rooted in community health workers or navigators. OPD supports an approach that would essentially bring together adult professionals as well as youth leaders from the private and public sector to assist in supporting children who are justice involved, to be also involved in the school and to guide options beyond the immediacy of negative options. Additionally, we believe that this approach creates an opportunity for the community health or navigator model to be used as a tactic that helps individuals in the community, but also works with schools, families, and human services agencies. This is what best addresses the needs of the children, as well as what best addresses the needs of the community, supports the family, and creates stronger communities. When we speak about education strategies, there is the National Partnership for Student Success. The National Partnership for Student Success is a public-private partnership between the U.S. Department of Education, AmeriCorps, Everyone Graduates Center, and this is located at Johns Hopkins University. This is a working collaboration of over 100 organizations that addresses the impact of lost instructional time and helps close opportunity gaps through a holistic response. I highlight these because as I spoke about the over-reliance on DJS and that we have systems that are already existing within Maryland at one of our higher institutions, Johns Hopkins, that has already begun this work. We must address these problems in a public health approach. And again, that includes looking at health, mental health, education, and community. We must look to developing quality mentoring relationships that increases a child's connection to their school and to their community. We must create situations where there are supports that exist for the family. Community strategies also include early warning and response systems, restorative justice, local care teams, and violence interrupters. When the new laws changed the way police have traditionally dealt with children, the laws also added tools that the police had to work with children. It is important to ensure that law enforcement is properly trained on the new laws and the procedures, especially when engaging with young children. And they must be trained to refer to the proper agencies for services. It's also important that officers are properly trained on what to do when a child is in their custody. And in doing so, there is greater trust in the criminal legal system, as well as we create opportunities and we create situations where children are safe, but also communities are safer. We must continue to invest in community services that reach children before they become system involved. We must think about immediate response. Community conferencing can help resolve things, excuse me, in as little as 2 weeks. Community conferencing programs brings everyone together immediately after an incident, avoiding the sometimes lengthy wait for official action from either the courts or other institutions. When we talk about accountability, everyone affected by the conflict decides how to resolve things. There is essentially, we are no longer merely talking about sanctions, but we're talking about being in a space where each of the partners are also responsible. 95% of the community conferences in Baltimore have resulted with a written agreement that was created by all the participants with over 95% compliance with those agreements. We also see that this will reduce overrepresentation of people of color in the criminal legal system. Over 97% of young offenders diverted from the juvenile justice system have been persons of color. Thereby, we can provide and must provide alternatives, and the very same alternatives that I would say that are available to many Caucasian young offenders. Restorative justice is accountability. When we speak with victims, we find that they prefer alternatives to incarceration beyond prison to hold people accountable. Even victims agree that if children become system involved, that they must focus on rehabilitation. There are some common human needs that we all experience, especially those who have been a victim of crime, and that is a need for safety, understanding, validation, information, apology, and repair. These are the needs that so often go completely unmet when someone is simply removed from the community and placed in detention or prison. Again, accountability. There are many services that already exist to address the needs of children beyond the Department of Juvenile Services that are currently underused and that can serve as a resource for law enforcement, children, and communities. Choice can be used both before and after system involvement. Statewide resources include the Maryland Coalition of Families, Maryland Crisis Services Centers, and Wraparound Maryland. Each of these organizations work to support families and children with behavioral health needs, such as mental health, substance abuse use, and family support services. These are the type of community services and programs that are necessary and should be used to replace the over-reliance on incarceration. These are the types of services and programs that were intended by the JJRA. We also have youth bureau services that work with children and families to build necessary skills to change the problem behaviors that we see. There's family-focused counseling, there's substance abuse treatment, there's school-based and school-linked services. These are all the keys when we talk about effective public safety. There are currently 7 youth service bureaus throughout the state serving Prince George's, Charles, Calvert, and Anne Arundel counties. Again, incarceration is punishment. When children are held accountable, they have the ability to take full responsibility for their behavior. And that means understanding what the behavior was, how it affected others, acknowledging that behavior, and working to change that behavior. We must not allow reactionary headlines to drag us back to this tough on crime discriminatory practice. The super myth predatory phrases are what drove many states, including Maryland, to enact racist carceral laws that deemed to be solutions to the problem. Supporting JJRA is a step in addressing these racial disparities. And I tell you to be very careful, even as we navigate now, because we are again hearing similar dog whistle terms and references. For example, I say catch and release. You'll hear the reference about how the children are being caught or arrested and immediately released. I dare you to challenge those terms, because when we think about catch and release, it's often referred to animals. And the reality is that when we're talking about children, especially in the juvenile justice system, we're talking about Black children. Black children continue to bear the burden of our societal and system failings. Now, a society that rejects its history or fails to learn from it is doomed to repeat it. I highlight to you that in the 1940s, Maryland codified the age of majority to 18. And this occurred in every jurisdiction except Baltimore City, where it remained at 16. So as a result, Black children from Baltimore City were incarcerated at a rate of 9 times higher than white children from outside the city. What we continue to see today is the same vestiges of that practice. So in 2020, while Black children were only 32% of the population, they made up 63% of DJS referrals. 90% of the children that are charged as adults are Black. Maryland disproportionately places Black children in detention. So, and although I highlight detention, I do emphasize as well that there's a disparate impact at every stage of the criminal legal system, especially as it applies to Black children. I now turn to Attorney Seegers to address how these impacted policies look in practice.
Thank you, Public Defender Dartigue, and good afternoon, Chairman Smith and distinguished members of the committee. Again, my name is Erin Seegers, and I'm Assistant Public Defender in the Juvenile Division right here in Anne Arundel County. It's my great privilege to represent some amazing youth here in the state of Maryland, and today I'm grateful for the opportunity to share more about juvenile laws and what they look like in practice. I first want to turn to the Juvenile Justice Reform Act. When we talk about juvenile jurisdiction, often we talk about a floor and a ceiling. Before the Juvenile Justice Reform Act, the JJRA, there was no floor. And that is what the Juvenile Justice Reform Act did. It placed the minimum age for juvenile jurisdiction involvement to be 10 years old for serious violent offenses and 13 years old for less serious charges. In the Juvenile Justice Reform Council, they did a lot of research. They looked at many studies, many practices around the country, including the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry in the United Nations, which recommends an age of 14 actually for a minimum age of jurisdiction. So there's a lot that went into the recommendation, the implementation of the JJRA, but I do want to draw attention to this picture we have here on the slide. This is not a picture a stock photo that we pulled from Google. It is not a picture from a TV show. It's not a picture from a movie. This picture is a picture of a 5-year-old little Black boy inside of an elementary school in Montgomery County, Maryland in the year 2020. And I think this picture speaks to the importance of the JJRA and the minimum age that we did establish here in the state of Maryland. However, I would say most of the conversation these days is around these children who are younger than 13 years old. That is despite the fact that that is an incredibly low number of the cases in the juvenile court system. It is a tiny percentage of the small percentage of juvenile crime overall. Juvenile crime in Maryland represents a relatively small portion of all cases in Maryland. In 2021, adults represented 93% of homicide arrests, and youth represented only 7% of homicide arrests in all arrests. And so this portion of children, 10, 11, 12, they are a teeny percentage of that already small percentage. And when we talk about children, it's important that we remember that children are different. And Secretary Schiraldi did a wonderful job just now explaining some ways that children are different. And many of us know just the common knowledge how they are. They're more impulsive. They're more vulnerable to stressors in their environments, more susceptible to peer pressure, or really, I would say, just peer presence. There are many studies that show just being around other peers, they don't even need to be pressured, but being around them causes them to make poor decisions and impulsive decisions. They have difficulty weighing the risks and the benefits of behaviors, and they have an over-reliance on reward in the here and now. And this image here represents the development of the adolescent brain. So if you look at the first brain here, the 5-year-old, that same child, the brain of that same child in that photo, to the age of 20, you see the vast difference when it comes to the maturation of the brain here. And many system-involved children, even that I work with, they themselves are at a developmental age that is below the chronological age. And so instead of wasting resources to arrest, detain, and evaluate children who might not be adjudicated because that becomes the issue of competency, what we need to do is immediately direct them to services and supports that are age appropriate and are really going to make a difference in their life and in their development. Because especially the children, again, looking at that age range of 10 to 12, that very small percentage of children who had cases before the JJRA, many of them, because they're so young and even past the age of 12, they are not what we call competent to proceed in a case. They do not understand what is happening. They don't understand their rights. And so that becomes a very expensive, lengthy, resource-heavy process when in reality, we could just intervene quicker and give, again, children the services that they need that are appropriate to their age in the community. Many youth as well in the delinquency system have either unidentified or unmet special education needs. In fact, 2/3 of boys and 3/4 of girls who are in detention have psychiatric disorders that qualify for special education services. And so I do want to turn to detention and the truth about detention and these children who are in detention. One thing I do want to point out is that the JJRA has not caused a dramatic decrease in the detention of children. We are in need still of better data tracking and information, but the data that we do have says that in Baltimore City, 51% of the children arrested this year were released and compared to 58% the year before. So there has not been a dramatic difference in that. Another piece of data that we do have is that more children have been detained in Baltimore City in 2023 than in the past 2 years. In 2023, 401 youth were detained compared to 271 in 2022 and 274 in 2021. Of the 401 children who were detained, 185 of them were incarcerated in juvenile detention, and 216 of those children were charged as adults. And this practice of detention, it has a great impact on our children. I just mentioned in the last slide about how many of these youth who are in detention need special education services, and detention leads to education disruption. 40% of incarcerated youth have a learning disability. And all youth who are incarcerated face challenges accessing education services after their incarceration. But we know that detention reduces a youth's future earning abilities and their future outcomes. When working with children, I'm often having to explain to them, the consequences now and the consequences later. And we also need to consider that as well, both the educational consequences for children while they're in detention, as well as when they exit detention and exit the juvenile justice system. And all of this, I would like to blanket this conversation with this idea of the presumption of innocence. And I'm always happy to be a person in the room that reminds us all that children also are presumed to be innocent until they are found to be involved, which is the same as guilty in adult court. So of those children who are in detention in the state of Maryland, some are in detention after a finding of involvement, but many are held before they're found involved. And so many of these children are detained, but they are presumed innocent. And when we are talking about what the media is talking about, what others are talking about in the community, I think it's important that we stress that children, just like adults before they're found guilty, are also presumed to be innocent. At this point, I want to give a couple examples of a couple cases. And again, Secretary Schiraldi did a great job of going very in detail about the life of a case. And I want to do the same, but highlighting places of intervention and places where we can respond in the best way that will help children, which of course in return helps the community. So first example we have here of a 10-year-old child who is charged with a serious violent offense. So again, under the JJRA, if they are charged with a serious violent offense, they meet that exception. So they are able to be charged and adjudicated in adult court. On the onset with that interaction with the police, often at that point as well, that is a stage where the state's attorney's office could also be involved, where often the police will call the state's attorney and ask for advice on how to handle the case. I would say even from the very first start, that is a place where we can intervene and refer children and recommend services for children right there from that first interaction. From there, as was explained earlier, there is the potential for a child to be detained, whether that's in a juvenile detention center or community detention with an ankle monitor where they are on house arrest. I'll say that is another point to where children can receive services and get the help that they might need. And then finally, after going through the adjudication, and if they're found involved, they could be placed on probation where they can get many of the services that Public Defender Darteed presented in the community with the support of their family and school and health care. Second example is of a 13-year-old child who is charged with auto theft. So that is motor vehicle theft, unlawful taking is also a felony in Maryland. So if you have a 13-year-old who is charged with a felony of auto theft, it's a very similar process because it is a felony. They can also be detained. They can also receive services from the very get-go when they are interacting with police. They can get services at the point of an intake hearing, which is the hearing in between a child getting charged and a child reaching their adjudication. At that point too, they also can get referrals for services for mental health care at that point as well. And then, of course, as they go on probation, as well as if they are sent to a juvenile placement. Now, as I'm talking about the juvenile process, I'm talking about due process. And another reminder I like to give everyone always is that children also have rights. They have rights just as adults have rights. And the Child Interrogation Protection Act was incredibly important to make sure that we are protecting our children's rights. With the Child Interrogation Protection Act, and I do want to give a special thanks to sponsor Senator Jill Carter as well as Sandy Bartlett and their sponsorship of this act. But it makes law enforcement, it says that they must refrain from conducting a custodial interrogation of a child until they have confidentially consulted with an attorney about their rights. So custodial interrogation only occurs when the child is being detained by the police and when the child is being directly questioned by the police in connection with a crime that they're potentially being charged with. It does not prevent law enforcement from conducting investigation. It does not prevent them from conducting witness interviews, speaking with community members, or even interrogating children who have been properly informed of their rights and choose to waive them. What SIPA does is ensure that children who are being detained, interrogated, understand their rights by the advice of an attorney who has been specifically trained in age-appropriate communication of their Miranda rights and their Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. That does, again, apply to children as well. This is about protecting the basic due process rights of children, and particularly Black and Brown children who are disproportionately stopped, searched, arrested, and interrogated by police every day in Maryland. It does nothing more than that. It does nothing less. And so there are myths about what the law enforcement can or cannot do, but it is truly as simple as that. And there are many important, I apologize. There are many important reasons, again, behind the Child Interrogation Protection Act, but really I want to get down to the bottom line, which is the Child Interrogation Protection Act helps prevent false confessions of children. So youth are 3 times more likely to falsely confess than adults. And again, I want to repeat that, 3 times more likely to falsely confess than adults. And 30% of those who were exonerated for crimes they were convicted of as children, and 80% of those exonerated for crimes allegedly committed before they turned 14 years old had falsely confessed, compared to only about 10% of those exonerated for crimes that they are convicted of as adults. So this was a major issue for children, and SIPA helps prevent this from happening. When children learn of their rights and they're able to speak with an attorney, one that is trained in speaking with children, when they learn what the rights are and that they do not have to waive them, that protects them and stops false confessions. In conclusion, again, we are talking today about how do we keep children and communities safe. And the solutions that we present today is a focus and investment in health, education, and the community. So today we end by asking you all that we take steps to create and support community programs and intervention, that we allow time for the JJRA and SIPA to really work as intended, and that we invest in communities and not cages. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Ms. Seegers and Mr. Dartig. That will conclude the presentation from the Maryland Public Defenders. We'll now hear from the State's Attorneys Association. And Mr. Gibson, or Mr. Kroll. Who's going to open us up?
I'll
Mr.
start 2
Kroll, okay.
minutes.
Everyone else can. There's space available. You can come on up.
Chairman, Mr. Vice Chair, members of the committee, good afternoon. I'm Stephen Kroll. I'm the State's Attorney Coordinator for Maryland, Executive Director of the Maryland State's Attorneys Association. And I've been prosecuting cases, yes, since 1984, including juvenile cases. Members of the committee, juvenile crime is a serious problem in Maryland. There's an imbalance in the present law against victims, parents, and prosecutors. The Maryland State's Attorneys Association will identify these challenges and provide solutions to each and every one of them. And in doing so, I call upon the Maryland State's Attorney President, the State's Attorney for Howard County, the Honorable Rich Gibson, to start us off.
Thank you, Steve. Good morning, Chairman Smith, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss with you the critical issues impacting our community related to juvenile crime. My presentation today is going to be focused on 2 issues. Each of us will take on different issues before you to kind of keep things organized. The issues that I'll be addressing are the fact that the juvenile justice system, while supposed to be focused on rehabilitation, has time constraints which limit our ability to effectively course correct and reform juveniles deemed by the court to have engaged in criminal conduct. The second issue is the inability of the courts to detain a juvenile who commits a technical violation while on probation. Under the current laws, if a juvenile is found fact sustained, which is the equivalent of being found guilty in adult court, for misdemeanors, the amount of time that the court has to supervise them is initially limited to a 6-month period, extendable at 3-month intervals up to a year. For felonies, maximum initial sentence is a year, extendable in periods up to 3 years if shown by clear and convincing evidence that it's in the best interest of the child. Why is this a problem? It's a problem because services and placement in appropriate programs are often not immediately available. There's frequently a wait list. There's frequently time constraints. There's frequently challenges in matching the child's issues with the root cause that was driving them to engage in criminal behavior in the first place. All right. I also want to address an issue that was raised in prior presenters. In Howard County specifically, 90% of the youth that we interact with are treated in the community. So we're not incarcerating the majority of the kids we interact with. The overwhelming majority of the kids we interact with are treated in the community with services, provided we can get them appropriate services. Again, the problem is the clock is running and they may not be matched with services immediately. So we need more high quality service options. For instance, for Spanish speaking individuals, respondents, we don't really have a lot of services available for them, right? So the clock is running, but we're not remediating, we're not doing anything to change the criminal behavior. Additionally, the criminal behavior may be deeply ingrained. And so the period of time that the state has to address the root cause would be insufficient to affect change. If the behavior is not modified, we failed that child. We failed the community that is exposed to that child's negligent and criminal behavior. And we've set that child up for a more punitive response when they hit the magical age of 18. And that is problematic. Second issue, technical violations of probation. Technical violations, and I guess I'll distinguish between the two. There are technical violations of probation and there are substantive violations of probation. Substantive violations of probation are committing a new crime, violating a stay away order or no contact order, or completely absconding from your programming. So you're sentenced to programming in Maryland, you just leave the state or something. Those are substantive violations of probation. Technical violations are the majority of violations we see. And by way of example, a respondent, a juvenile that comes before the court is found fact sustained, is given 100 hours of community service to do. They do 10 and stop. They're told they have to stay clean and not use drugs. They test positive on drug tests that are performed. They're ordered to pay restitution to the victim who they've destroyed their car when they stole it and they refuse to pay, or they're ordered to stay in school and they don't go to school. And these are technical violations. The court has no power currently to detain for technical violations. Why is this a problem? We're teaching our children that they can do what they want with impunity and there are no consequences for their actions. Some solutions that I would pose. One, the juvenile justice system is rehabilitatively focused. Remove the time and limitations. The court can decide whether the child, after a period of time, is moving in the right direction and society is safe to have them come back, and we hopefully will never see them as an adult. Our goal is not to incarcerate these people. Our goal is to get them on a path where they're contributing members of society, right? So remove the time limitations and focus it on actually the reform metrics for that child. And allow the courts to, after a hearing, detain technical violations of probation if they're violating and they're not progressing in a positive way. Doesn't mean the court has to detain, but the court should have the option if this child is just refusing to comply with the conditions that we've set in place when they've already been found guilty of violating our laws. I'll now allow, next speaker, I believe it's Mr. McCarthy. Oh, Ms. Braveboy, thank you.
Thank you. Okay. All right, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Chairman Smith and honorable members of the Judicial Proceedings Committee. For the record, I'm Aisha Braveboy, State's Attorney for Prince George's County, and I'm here just to give you a little perspective from my office. Last year, between January and November, there were about 610 cases referred to us involving young people. The majority of those cases were for auto-related offenses, including auto theft, vandalism, as well as carjackings. In addition to that, armed robberies was the next largest category of offenses that we saw. So we see a lot of young people who are choosing to commit violent offenses, often times using weapons, specifically guns, to commit those offenses. And so what we have are a lot of victims of very violent crimes who we have to seek justice for in a system that I believe correctly values rehabilitation. So we support rehabilitation for young offenders. We also understand that as a part of rehabilitation, accountability and consequences are key to ensuring that young people don't reoffend. And so the goal of the juvenile justice system, of course, is to rehabilitate. And as I mentioned, we support that. And in fact, specifically, I support that personally, because I've worked in diversion for a long period of time. And I want to thank personally and professionally the work that our Department of Juvenile Services is doing in this area. We have a great partnership with them. We have opened a Saturday Family Justice Academy in Prince George's County to work with justice-involved young people and their parents. I think one of the key ingredients in making all of the efforts around diversion work is not to just try to quote unquote fix the child, but also to try to intervene in the family. We've helped parents access mental health. We've helped parents access opportunities for housing. And also we are now reaching out to employers to work with them to ensure that our parents of our children have gainful, meaningful, and appropriate employment for parents who have the responsibility of raising children. But none of this works if there are not, incentives or really direction by the courts that can be enforced, that young people take advantage of all of the opportunities that the Department of Juvenile Services has, or in our case, what we have at the local level. So it's really important, part of a diversion process, that there be a level of accountability for those who have been ordered or directed to diversion programs to actually complete those programs. And so our goal is to work with the Department of Juvenile Services and really any partner that we have to ensure that we do have programs available at the local level. In our case, we have Teen Court, which is a diversion program. We have a program for girls called P31 Girls. We work with another organization called Resilient Youth. And we also work with the Community Public Awareness Council. All of these program options are community-based. And most, if not all of them, have a component that works with families, that works with the parent or guardian of the young person as well. And so as we move forward to create, I think, a better system, because we would not be here if the system was working. None of us would be here if this system, current system, was working appropriately. But whatever we do, we have to ensure that anything that is ordered is actually complied with, and that we include parents and guardians as part of the rehabilitation process. So I look forward to having further discussion with you during the Q&A period. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is John McCarthy. I'm the State's Attorney in Montgomery County. I think I speak for everybody when I say that what we are honored to be here with you, but at the same time, our primary goal, I think, for all of us as the bottom line, is public safety. We're not trying to play politics with any of these particular issues. I would also, just as a starting point, realize that the men and women that are professional people that are standing here with me, we see about 30% of children that come into the juvenile justice system. About 70% of the children that come into the juvenile justice system are never seen by the people at this table. They are diverted or held at intake, or the case is informally adjusted. Some jurisdictions have different terms they use. I would make a point of disagreement about the numbers, because I think, let me say, maybe it's a clarification about the numbers. The fact that arrests are down of juveniles is a much misleading indication of what's happening with our kids in Maryland. In my own county, I will tell you, and I have the numbers here with me from 2019 to today's date. For instance, when it comes to auto theft is up from 44 to 364. That's up. Carjacking is up 200%. Gun offenses are up 220%. The kinds of cases that the community is really interested in are all up and staggeringly up in huge numbers. Arrests for liquor issues, in my case, over the last 4 years, go from 107 to 16. CDS arrests go from 344 to 33. Vandalisms go from 48 to 8. Possession of implements of drugs go from 300 to 27. Now, I could do this and get up to 1,000 less arrests very quickly. I'm telling you, that's not because those offenses are not happening. That's because in many of our counties, we are under policed. We're down to about 300 police officers. And the police are not happy about the revolving door as they see it in DJS in terms of enforcing these kinds of laws, and they're forced. You can't ignore a carjacking. You can't ignore a shooting where in terms of juveniles that were involved in shootings, in 2019 in my county it was 16. Last year it was 40. I can give you the numbers for all of the offenses, but I think in every significant category the community is caring about, the numbers are significantly up. That's why we're having this conversation, not because of shoplifting, not because of liquor violations. I would also say to you, repeat offenders. We've had a couple of instances. Probably the worst was a situation where someone who was on their 6th or 7th car theft, it was brought to my attention by the head of my juvenile division. We never knew that we're the first 5 or 6. The 6th or 7th one got papered. We are not under the law now told about, and I agree with the secretary, we're told about crimes of violence, but we're not told about auto thefts, which are skyrocketing in all of our communities. That's a felony, but it's not a crime of violence. We're not told about false fire alarms. I know that there are communities that have been wrecked with false fire alarms by young people in our community, where we lost days of school in multiple high schools in our community last year because of false fire alarms. Distribution of drugs. The secretary talked about an epidemic about opiates. Besides the fact that the period of probation, as my friend Rich talked about earlier, sometimes is not lengthy enough. How can you ever cure an opiate issue in 6 months? When the studies and the statistics tell you need about 18 months to 2 years to deal with a kid who has an opiate. Or we've artificially set up situations that are setting us up for failure through legislation. I would ask that we begin to consider expanding the categories of things like first-degree burglary, motor vehicle theft, all felonies. Let us, as state's attorneys, have what we had before, the ability to have those matters referred to us so that we may put a second additional set of eyes on it. We have a number of other suggestions. I will tell you, in some instances, some of the things that's happened, I'm state's attorney, was here when Andy Sonner was here. I was here when Doug Ansel was here. I've been here nearly 20 years. We had a teen court. Our teen court, because none of these is actually the numbers have almost disappeared with the number of kids that can put into this program. And I will say this, we also always took careful attention to make sure that those diversionary programs were offered, and we studied every year and kept book on whether or not they represented the racial diversity of Montgomery County, which is the most racially diverse county in this state. And we always tried to make sure that we were making it look like the community that we were serving. I yield my time.
Good afternoon. My name is Catherine Rosenblatt. I am the Deputy of the Juvenile Division for Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office. Currently, DJS controls what cases are handled by the State's Attorney's Office and when we receive those cases. The DJS intake workers are neither law enforcement nor attorneys, yet they are in the position of reviewing charges and statutes and making critical decisions about public safety and child welfare. The proposed 24-hour mandatory hold for youth arrested for crimes of violence, handgun charges, as well as motor vehicle thefts would ensure judicial review of the cases and of the youth's detention status. We still see instances of cases referred by DJS to my office as specials, as my jurisdiction calls them. Those are cases that are for immediate charging and detention review, where DJS has already released the youth. When Mr. Bates and other state's attorneys advised that their hands were tied, it was because any and all nonviolent cases, including felony motor vehicle thefts, can be diverted without the state's attorney's office knowing. Even when motor vehicle thefts were skyrocketing, because DJS is not mandated currently to forward those cases to the state's attorney's office, we were unable to address the cases as they came in, unless a DJS intake worker decided to send it. Frequently, this meant we were only getting cases after the youth had committed multiple car thefts. In 2023 alone, we charged nearly as many car theft related cases as the entire charging cases we had in 2021 and in 2022. We charged approximately 299 car theft related cases in 2023. We had a total of approximately 327 cases in entirety in 2022. There are two main ways that cases get referred to the state's attorney's office: by special, which as talking with state's attorneys I've found is a Baltimore City specific terminology, and paper referrals. Specials are cases forwarded with more immediate charging and detention review. Paper referrals are when DJS declines to immediate charge and detain. It can take anywhere from a week to a month or more to send the case to the state's attorney's office, and then it needs to be scheduled for an arraignment so that the trial date is anywhere from 4 to 6 months after the offense. While this mimics the adult system, it leaves both the youth and the community unaccounted for. The proposed 24-hour hold on crimes of violence, handguns, and motor vehicle thefts would ensure immediate review of the most serious and most pressing offenses. Thank you.
Ms. Dykes.
Good afternoon. Jamie Dykes, State's Attorney for Wycomico County. I've spent almost 2 decades doing my best working within the law to keep my entire community safe, to hold those who victimize others accountable. And as of October 1st of 2022, SEPA, the Child Interrogation Protection Act, effectively prevents questioning of juvenile suspects and specifically forbids an unrepresented but knowing, intelligent, and voluntary waiver of Miranda by a juvenile or a juvenile's parents. Such a rule does not apply in adult cases and has never before been applied in juvenile cases until SEPA. Appellate interpretation of both state and federal courts have guided law enforcement in the constitutional conduct of all interrogations, protecting both the public safety and the rights of the accused. I want to correct one thing that was presented by the Office of the Public Defender, indicating that SEPA applies only when a juvenile is detained. That is not true. That is not true. It says in custody retains its judicially determined meeting. A court determines under a totality of the circumstances test, which includes 36 factors, whether a child, a person, is in custody, with special consideration given to a child's age. In practice, the artificial strictures of SEPA have eliminated otherwise constitutional and lawful questioning as an investigative tool. Members of this body expect, as you should, that law enforcement keep the peace and protect the community. It is, however, too much to expect law enforcement, prosecutors, and courts to keep the public safe with their hands tied behind their backs. With the changes implemented in 2022, that is what you have asked us to do. Wycomico County, specifically Salisbury, Maryland, is in the throes of a gang war. Battles are being executed by high schoolers, illegally armed with handguns and extended magazines over teenaged notions of disrespect. The war between our east and our west sides floods our streets and our schools. Wycomico is not the only jurisdiction suffering. All of our children are at risk. Since the enactment of SEPA, my office has charged as adults and is prosecuting cases involving juvenile defendants and suspects alleged to have committed murder, attempted murder, armed carjacking, and similarly violent crimes, too many of those with firearms. These cases are pending trial. The presumption of innocence remains with those charged. I'm limited on what I can say, and my fellow prosecutors are limited on what they can say publicly about those cases. What I can say is that in each of those cases, SEPA restrictions have impeded law enforcement efforts to gather information about crimes and those involved, including the efforts to identify potential accomplices and co-conspirators. This is unsurprising to those of us in law enforcement. Since April 15th of 2023, Salisbury has had 38 other reported shootings, so many that are unreported. 38 times that a person or people in our community was shot or shot at. We averaged 2.3 gunshot wound victims every month last year. While this number may seem minuscule to my fellow state's attorneys in more populated jurisdictions, each one of those victims is my neighbor. I personally know someone connected with each and every victim. The impact, the trauma, is felt by my entire community, the effects of which are becoming exponential and will affect all of our communities for decades to come. We as prosecutors sit with families of these victims and we mourn with them. We listen to the 911 calls, mothers pleading with dispatch personnel for a way out of the neighborhoods plagued by violence, because they want their children to live a better life. They want their children to be safe in their beds while they sleep. That doesn't seem like too much to ask. As I've said before, we've been fortunate in Wycomico. In most murder cases, we have suspects in custody within days. This last year, that's not been our experience. The inability of law enforcement to develop sufficient evidence to charge as rapidly as we have in the past, and the attendant public safety risk while those offenders remain out of custody, free from accountability, is the direct result of what happened here in 2022. The word is out. Law enforcement in Wycomico, and I suspect other jurisdictions, are seeing encounters with adults who claim they are juveniles and encounters with juveniles who readily declare that nothing can be done to them. The legislation passed over the last 3 to 4 years has reinforced, and inspired a lack of cooperation by witnesses and emboldened violent offenders who see the work done here as a license to continue offending. Witnesses have less and less confidence that law enforcement, prosecutors, and the courts can keep them safe, so they withdraw from the process, from speaking out, from speaking truth. They keep their mouths shut. They see that silence as a matter of survival. SEVA puts children at risk. It puts our communities and the entire state at significant risk of extreme and chronic violence. Our children are suffering, becoming prey to more seasoned adult offenders who want to avoid accountability themselves. In those cases, there is little likelihood that law enforcement can identify those adult offenders and keep those juveniles safe. Given that law enforcement cannot speak directly to juvenile suspects, it is our children who are more likely to be killed by other children wielding guns. Fiscal year 23 over 21, intake referrals to DJS in Wycomico County increased 86%. That included crimes of violence increasing and felonies increasing. In 2023, firearms incidents on the entire Eastern Shore, non-fatal shootings are up 59% over 2022. Shots fired complaints up 109% over 2022. First-degree assaults with firearms up 129% over 2022. I believe that our efforts should be focused on identifying and addressing the root causes of this violence by and against our young people, rather than limiting law enforcement's ability to investigate it and state's attorney's ability to prosecute it. Crimes of violence, ladies and gentlemen, are different. The harm that is done to the victims is different. The way it affects our communities is different. We should be working together to make sure that there are less victims, not mandating policy that is certain to create more victims. Thank you.
Chairman, this is our presentation.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you all for your time today. We'll now turn it back over to the committee for questions, and we'll start off with Senator Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Since we're taking everybody together, if you don't mind, I'm going to have questions for each of the different groups. So I'm going to start, if you don't mind, is Secretary Schiraldi still here? And I hope you don't mind. I want to take my time because I want to ask you, Secretary Schiraldi, if you can, for clarity, can you walk us through the SINS petition process? I'll clarify. So for SINS petitions, it's my understanding, according to law, they can be filed by anyone. Is that correct?
Correct.
They can be filed by law enforcement officers?
Yes.
Can they? And they can be filed by a parent.
Parents,
is that
yeah.
correct?
And teachers.
So what are the restrictions on which a SINS petition could be filed, if any?
I mean, if people think a kid is in need of supervision, they can file a SINS petition. So we've had a sevenfold increase because we explained it more during the course of this year to go around to law enforcement and teachers, helping them understand. And we're going to keep explaining it because I think people still don't fully get it.
Are there any specific circumstances under which Department of Juvenile Services refuses to accept a petition?
I mean, sometimes we just provide the kid with services, and we don't always have to go to court to provide a kid with services. And sometimes the families are fine with that. As long as they get the services, they don't necessarily need to go to court. So
I'm making an effort to address specifically the children that cannot be prosecuted under the law, the under 10s, the 9-year-olds, the
Right.
7-year-olds, and in some instances, maybe even a 10 or 11-year-old for a misdemeanor offense. In those situations, it's my understanding you've been going around the state educating law enforcement officers and officials about filing these petitions. I'm trying to get at, are there still obstacles or challenges in those instances to having those petitions filed and acted upon?
I think the biggest obstacle is that people just weren't aware of them. But you can get all the services you can get from DJS through a SINS petition process other than incarceration. The only thing we can't do to a 12-year-old on a SINS case is detain them or place them in one of our correctional facilities. But everything else, you can even be in a group home, you can be in foster care, you can get multi-systemic therapy, you can get mentoring, everything else you can get. And I just don't think people understood that. I'm not saying everyone should get all those things, but you can get them all.
How many of these petitions would you say, do you have the numbers have been filed, or just about how many, and has there been a great uptick recently?
I just know there was a sevenfold increase once we started talking. I do not have the exact number of how many there are.
Do you have any data as to the outcomes
Yes.
of the petitions?
Yeah, so the kids under the age of 13, the recidivism rates went from 34% down to, I think it was 13% or 18%. It's more than half. It declined by more than half, so it's 13%.
There's been some talk about also from the state's attorneys and specifically criticism of the probation periods. And so it's my understanding that I know it's not my understanding, it's the law, that probation can be extended for good cause. So for example, if a child is placed on probation and they have not yet been able to partake of or complete the rehabilitative services or programs recommended, it would be a case like that where that probation could then be extended for good cause, would it not?
For 2 3-month periods for kids that are in misdemeanor cases. So they get 6 months, the judge could extend it for 3 months and again for 3 months if the judge feels by a clear and convincing standard that the case needs to be extended.
Are you aware, and I'll ask the state's attorneys this, they probably will have different answers, but are you aware of any specific cases or a cadre of cases where the court or magistrate has been frustrated because they were like, this probation period is too short, I need to extend it so this child can get the services, but the law is preventing me from extending it?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, yes. I mean, and this is something that you should ask both the defenders and the state's attorneys about. I think the area where judges are in a difficult spot is if, as was said, a kid is on misdemeanor probation, we are trying to get them into anger management. There's a waiting list. We get 4 months into the 6-month period, and the kid finally gets that anger management. He's only got it for 2 months. And then somebody's making a motion to extend. I think there's a legitimate argument to be had in a courtroom that I'm never sitting in. So that's why I'm saying you should ask other people as to whether the judge will extend that, because to some degree, the judge doesn't feel it's the kid's fault. So why should they be punished? But really get that more from them.
In cases where probation ends, but a child is in, say, a therapeutic treatment program or some other program that seems to be working for them, are there restrictions on when there could be probation after services.
No.
Are there, but how often does that happen? Does that happen?
Yeah, we.
Does
provide
probation
kids-
end and the services continue?
Yeah, and the other thing happens too, which is the kids never formalized and we provide them services. So both ends.
Okay, and finally, for Secretary Schiraldi, I interrupted you, and so I wanted you to continue because I want everybody to be clear about the process, including us, about the SINS petition. From filing, then what happens? What is the process on a SINS petition?
I'm gonna
If you can-
actually ask Kara to come up on this because we presented this to law enforcement throughout the state. We actually put the process up on our website and we created a form so that law enforcement could make it easier to make those referrals. But since I
Have
just shy
they
of 1
come
year,
back
I'm-
to you, any of them, and said, we're frustrated because this isn't working for us?
Law
We
enforcement-
tried it and it's not working.
Oh, I haven't heard them say that's not working. I would say law enforcement's frustrated with the reform law, but not
The
because
SINS
they,
process.
when we've explained it to them, I've not heard back from them that they are unable to do the process as we described it. I have not heard that. But I will now turn it over to Kara Annenson, our ledge director, to describe, and she's got that form up that I just described.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks. I'll quickly just go through what the process is. So the Department of Juvenile Services would get the police report. We would review the police report just like we do with any other case. We would meet with the young person. We would meet with the family. We would use our tool that we use, our intake decision tool, to identify what are the needs and what are the strengths and what are the risks of that young person. We would then connect that young person to services. We would try that first. If that doesn't work, then we have the opportunity to forward that case to court. So we would meet with the family. We could either put them on some sort of pre-court supervision. We could connect the kids to services, have them go back into the community, get services, or forward the petition for formal court action. Does that help explain?
Have
the
you
process?
had, so I'm not asking about your explanation to law enforcement about how to use it, but actual officers or agencies that attempted to go through this process and came back and said, the process is too flawed, it simply does not work.
Not to my knowledge. Is that what you're at? Yes.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I'm asking. So, okay, I just wanted, that was it.
Thanks.
Thanks, sir. Actually, since we're on this, staying on the SINS piece, and I think part of this actually, I don't want to tie in because I know we've got several questions, but so you said you had a 7%, a sevenfold increase in the petitions that you've received in the last year or so. Is it? So an important question to understand is how many of those folks do you know have actually received services? Do you have that information?
No,
All right.
depends on, we are getting that, but if they're placed on pre-court supervision, they all at least receive supervision, and the overwhelming majority of them receive services.
And that's part of the genesis of the frustration is, hey, how many people are actually getting the services? Are there enough services available? Two is what happens, and you hear this, I heard this all interim. What happens when someone just blows it off? What is the remedy for someone saying, you know what? I'm not participating. I'm out.
So a variety of things up to and including referral to the state's attorneys for formalization. So some of those things could be we sit down with the kid and their mother. Some of those things could be we just sit down with the kid. We bring other people in, we refer to other services, but a whole range of stuff can happen. But at that point, we can actually say, okay, we're done with this. You're going to get referred.
And then the third part of that chain is how often has that actually been done?
So I got to get you that data.
Can I piggyback on that
Yeah,
before?
no. I don't want to be too disjointed. So while we're on SINS, let's do SINS and then we'll move on.
So it kind of does weave into another question that could come up by another member or even us at a later time, but there's been, so much information put out there. Some of it may be accurate, some of it inaccurate. And so just so that we're all clear about your intake process, DJS, whether it is a SINS petition or whether it's potential delinquency petition, what exactly is the review process? Who conducts the review? And is there kind of an overseer of the initial reviewer to make sure that the decisions are accurate? Like, what is the actual intake review process of either a SINS petition or a delinquency petition?
Right, so these are what I talked about in my opening comments. This is where we use the risk assessment instrument, talk to the family, talk to the victim, make a decision. That can be appealed by the police. If it's a decision to not process the case forward, they can appeal it to the state's attorney. And then we provide data, which we will be delivering you all our data books for last year this week on every county and on every stage of that decision-making process.
Have you had many cases where the officers, the police department has chosen to override your decision and say you're wrong, we want it referred to the prosecutors?
Doesn't happen much, man, but I will find the data and I'll get it back to the committee. A whole list of questions was sent to me about 2 hours ago, but I didn't have the chance to pull all that data. What I will say, I just want to go back to my original testimony. 92.5% of the times we divert a kid, they don't get a new conviction or youthful adjudication that year. So these are all totally relevant and legitimate questions. They're kind of input questions, but the outcome is 92.4% of the times they don't get rearrested or don't reconvicted of a new crime.
Okay, thank you. That's it for, well, we're gonna go on with
Yeah.
the secretary and we'll take everybody.
So yep, let's go to Senator Folden, and then we have Senator West and Senator Wallstreicher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, good to see you.
Good to
Thanks
see
for
you,
coming
sir.
out. So I just have a couple, they gotta be questions / comments. So I'm just curious. The chairman always is really good. He kind of took a little bit of my thunder, so he's with his very thorough questions. So when you talked about the 7-fold increase in SINS petitions, would you say that that has a direct correlation with the number that the decrease in charges being applied by officers?
I think it was a combination of things because the numbers weren't going up that much until we started to do the informational sessions with.
Well, the law didn't go into effect till around that same time as well.
No, law went into effect June of 22.
Correct. So we've had 1 year of data.
Yeah, and I didn't, I came
Around
here
law.
and it's 18 months now.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. So around the same time you've been going around teaching.
So there were 6 months prior to when I arrived that the law was in effect, and there were very low numbers of SINS petitions. Once we started to do what we call lunch and learns with law enforcement, the numbers started to skyrocket.
Yeah, and I just, I want to.
But I just don't think the police knew how to do it. They just.
Oh, no, I'm a police officer. We know how to do it. There's just a lack of support from your office.
They just.
So I mean, I'll be very blunt on that.
Sure.
Your office, so when we talk about the 92.5% that don't reoffend within a year, I find it interesting that you know that number, but you can't tell us how many of the referrals that were sent to the state's attorney's office or things that are very important in this discussion today.
I came with that number because that was part of what I was prepared. I just got these other
Correct.
questions right before the hearing, so I didn't.
I understand, but
But I
it's,
will get them to you though.
it's the thing that we're putting out once again, the narrative publicly, and we're going to send the other numbers after the fact. That's one of my areas that I have an issue with when it comes to the importance of this issue and how your office is handling it. So one of the things that I've heard constantly from law enforcement across the state is that your staff still predominantly remote working?
No.
So they come out more regularly? Because I can tell you that many officers are saying that they're contacting your office and they don't respond out to help.
I haven't heard that, and I would welcome you to forward any complaints like that to me.
Beautiful. And then I guess that's all I have for you. I'll wait for the other staff. Thank you,
Thanks,
Mr.
Senator.
Secretary.
Thank you, Senator Folden. Just also for the secretary and for everyone here, I did send the secretary a lengthy list of questions before today. Before this hearing, you obviously have not had an opportunity to respond to those, but that doesn't mean that questions are not going to come organically from members. Just to be clear on that. Senator West and then Senator Wallstreicher. But I do appreciate you being receptive to that.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I only have 1 or 2 questions on SINS. It's something I focused on many years ago when they were trying to get lawyers to volunteer to assist in the SINS courts. My understanding was SINS are kids, literally kids. But Is it correct that someone could be the subject of a SINS petition who is up to 18 years old?
I'm not a 18-year-old. Okay, so that's a new one. I didn't
Does
know
it,
that's under.
my impression was it was almost exclusively limited to kids under 12 or under 13 who were literally kids as opposed to teenagers. Am
Oh, no,
I wrong in that?
No, I didn't realize that 18-year-olds could be, but everybody under 18, yeah, sure. Sure, you can be 17.
Okay, thank you. That educates me. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Thank you. Just sticking with SINs, my questions are about the logistics by which these notifications happen. So if police want to file a SINs petition, what is the mechanism by which your department is notified? And then
They
I'll
can-
have a
They
follow-up.
can
on
literally just call us, but now we have the ability, now they have the ability to do it online as well.
that. And so walk me through that time-wise. So a juvenile crime happens in the middle of the night. It's somewhat serious. It's 1 a.m. Police officer fills out the online form. Who is the recipient of that form? What is the form that recipient sees it in? Is it an email? Is it a file that they have to pull up? If it is sent at 1 a.m., at what time will that form be viewed? And so I want to understand a real nitty-gritty on the logistics of that process.
Sure. So you just started, and this is where the issue Senator West raised as well. So let me try to parse that out a little bit. You started with the kid commits a crime. So let's just start by saying children in need of supervision don't have to commit a crime.
Sure.
It's a child in need of supervision is a child who requires guidance, treatment, or rehabilitation, and 1, is required by law to attend school and is habitually absent. 2, is habitually disobedient, ungovernable, and beyond the control of the person having custody, generally a parent. 3, acts in a way that is dangerous to self or others. And 4, has committed an offense applicable only to children, meaning skipping school, drinking alcohol, staying out past curfew, things like that, running away from home. Those are crimes that you and I can't commit, right? You can run away from home if you want. And so part of the reason we see a lot more of that for kids under 13, and that it's because if a kid actually commits a crime when they're 14, then police aren't going to file a SINs petition. They're just going to refer the kid to us. It's generally 12-year-olds, 11-year-olds, right, that they're referring when they actually are arresting them for a crime, because they can no longer prosecute them if that crime is nonviolent.
That's right. So let's say there's a fight and it's a second-degree assault and it's a 13-year-old. They
Right.
can't prosecute.
Right.
They can't bring them to you.
Fight might be violent, but let's say it's a
Well, second-degree assault
Oh,
is a
second-degree assault. Yeah,
is a
that's right,
misdemeanor.
that's right.
Now, these are
Right.
very serious
Right.
offenses and can be very dangerous to the person. But okay, so let's say it's a second-degree assault. There's a fight at 1 a.m. that breaks out and the person is not eligible to be referred to you. So a SINs petition is filed electronically at 1 a.m. I'm just trying to understand, where does that electronic document go to? Who is the recipient of it?
Right.
I don't mean DJS. I mean, who at DJS sees it?
Yeah,
At what
so the-
time do they see it? And what is that person's next step when they view that document?
Great. So it's a local intake office that sees that, and they're distributed throughout the state. Once they get the SINs complaint, they schedule a meeting with the young person and their family, complete the screening assessments, those tools I mentioned, and then figure out what the appropriate interventions will be. And then within 25 days, DJS has to make an intake decision, whether we're going to formalize that case or not. And we don't
Okay.
have to wait 25 days. We can provide that kid services that day, but that's the legal limits.
And I apologize for the repetition. I really am trying to understand.
Sure.
What triggers the 25-day tolling period? The filing by the police officer or the
Yeah.
receipt by the
Mhm.
local intake officer?
Yeah, I'll get you an answer. I don't know if it's the filing or the receipt.
Okay, and just so I'm clear, the receipt by the intake officer, will that be done the next day? Is it true? Is that true if it's the weekend or?
Next business day.
Okay, so if something's done at essentially Friday night, 1 a.m. Saturday, that won't be viewed until Monday.
Correct.
And when you say it triggers these next steps, will that process begin same day? I know it starts a 25-day period, but is there an intake officer whose job is essentially to do this? Or will that sit for a week while that intake officer otherwise has very serious business? Or, does the SINS petition start a process when it is received? Or is it just kind of go to the bottom of the pile and then the 25 days starts to toll?
I don't want to give you misinformation, so I'm gonna have to find out. I don't know exactly when that intake officer is gonna start that process.
Got it. And I apologize. I know there's lots of other people, just so I understand the back end. Okay, so they decide not to proceed in any court setting. And your indication is that under current law, they are required to indicate to the complainant, which in this example is a police officer, that they are not moving forward to allow some kind of appellate process for that police officer to either tell the court or to tell the state's attorney's office to tell the court. How is that notification done?
How do we notify them? Yeah, so we notify the arresting officer. It's either by phone or by email. We met with the Chiefs Association and Sheriff's Association and have begun to notify the referring agency as well as the individual police officer.
And is that systematized? In other words, the officer is coming in with a form, they're pressing a button on the website. Does the intake officer go back into that website and the person get official notice? Or is it possible it's a phone call that just goes to voicemail and says, hey, officer so-and-so, just FYI? Is it an email that's created unique? Or is there case management software that is allowing this to be systematized where an officer gets proper notice and has a thoughtful opportunity to appeal, or whether it's just like a fire hose stuff moving through that process?
Right now, it's a unique email. We're still working with the chiefs and the sheriffs about, getting that process to be improved.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you for your help.
So I thought you were gonna push even farther with that, with the notification, because let's say something sits to the 24th day. And then if there's notification that needs to happen within the state's attorney's office, then that process hasn't started for another however long. That's 24 days into the action before the state's attorneys get involved. Then also on the alternative, what if there are services, and how long does it take for them to enroll in services? It could be 3 months, it could be the next day.
Could be the next day, right?
So you're looking at, it would be interesting to see what that data looked like, because and what it will tell us, because you could have a lot of these things being kind of received and adjudicated on the 24th day, 20th day, 15th day, then services takes another 30 days, 20 days, whatever. You see, that's like 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, half a year of time before someone is even being addressed. And that's kind of like where our interest is peaked in the system. Okay. We have Senator McKay's next, and then we have Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, good to see you, sir.
Good to see you.
Thank you. My questions has to do with the different programs that we're offering to these juveniles in this situation, that kind of stuff. So you mentioned many of them, but can you name one or two that just focus on the family unit? And what I mean by that is like strengthening the parental unit between the child, their relationship. Is it like family therapy? Is it parental training? How do we go to the next? We're addressing the child or the juvenile. How do we talk about the family?
Yeah, so there's a couple of really good programs that there's evidence for, and my experience with them is generally really strong. I only remember 2 of the 3 names. I always forget the third name, but one of them is multi-systemic therapy and the other one's family functional therapy, and then family-centered treatment. All 3 of them work on what they call the family systems, not just the kid, to be sure, because they're the ones that did the crime, but also they're trying to get the family to essentially learn more about how to deal with a delinquent kid in ways that are going to help them stop being a delinquent kid and succeed.
Okay. Just to follow up for it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I listen to all the different programs and listen to your presentation, I guess the word that I didn't hear, maybe it was there, was accountability. It just seemed that we were not teaching accountability. and off ramps to handle here, there. And what are these programs doing and teaching about accountability? We understand that this is not an adult, okay?
Right.
However, when it comes to victims and dealing on the other side of the person, there's got to be some kind of basis of accountability. So where do we talk about accountability?
Yeah, so I thought I mentioned accountability a few times, but.
And I may have missed it, so.
But yeah, there's a different layers all up and down the chain. So restitution, kids are often ordered to pay restitution, and we're required to supervise that and make sure it happens. If they don't, we're required to report it. And then sometimes the kids get, when their probation ends, civil judgments that follow them into adulthood. Sometimes kids are put on probation or pre-court supervision, and being under supervision is an accountability measure. It's not prison, but it's not nothing. And then sometimes the kids are detained. Sometimes they're placed in group homes or in staff secure facilities. And sometimes they're locked up in a hardware secure facility. So it kind of goes up and down the chain. Sometimes courts order community service.
But it's there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's there most of the times. I'm not going to try to tell you that every single kid. Sometimes kids come in, they swipe something from a store, and not all that much happens other than their arrest, and they're being brought in to meet with a probation officer. And for some kids, that's enough. They go away and we never see them again.
Well, you may or may not remember, I have 8 kids.
Yeah, I do.
And so the number one thing that I teach my children, and I think is important for every parental, is that our choices have consequences.
Yep.
It doesn't mean I'm going to love you any less,
Right.
But our choices have consequences. And I tend to believe that accountability needs to be at every single level. That doesn't mean locking you up. That doesn't mean don't care about you. That doesn't mean we don't try to identify what the problem is. But there literally has to be not an excuse, but some form of accountability. And it's not always punitive, but it does have to be part of the conversation, part of the therapy, if we're going to fix people. And going back to the whole family unit, I tend to believe we need to go to the root cause and how do we strengthen the family unit.
And I remember my meeting with you very well. I
So-
really do.
So
Senator.
that may be good or bad. I'm sorry. I regress. No, I'm just kidding. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This question is for our state's attorney from Prince George's County. First, thank you for joining us out here in Annapolis. Welcome back as always. I had a couple of questions. You mentioned a couple of programs, some diversion programs. I wasn't quite familiar with any of them, but it's good to know that we do have some of these programs in the county. I wanted to get your take on how is your office interacting. I was hearing, for the first time, I'm new to the Judiciary Committee, so hearing about DJS and how they deal with the sins and all of these other things, some terminology I'm getting used to at this point. But how does your office specifically deal with these diversion programs as children come in with what is this? The non-felony with misdemeanor actions.
Right. So for obviously for the felonies, they refer to our office for prosecution. For those misdemeanor offenses that would otherwise be handled by the Department of Juvenile Services, we've partnered with a number of community-based programs to ensure that those kids are getting those services. And in one instance, we decided to go a little further and say, okay, we want parents to also be involved, and that's our Family Justice Academy that the department supported, and we truly appreciate it. So far, we've had about 26 referrals. Most of them came from the department. Some of them have come from the school system because we do ask the school system to provide us with referrals for kids who are, let's say, habitually truant and may need some additional support. But primarily, they've come from the Department of Juvenile Services, and none of those kids have reoffended. And of the 26 referrals, I think about 7 have completed the program. And so we have about 19 active cases currently, and we believe that those will increase. We also have teen court. Teen court is a great opportunity for young people to get involved in the understanding the criminal justice system. So we have young people who actually participate almost like a mock trial as defense attorneys, as prosecutors, and also sit as judges and juries essentially for these kids. And they are able to recommend sanctions for those kids who are found to be involved. And that program has been very successful. It's been around for quite some time. As of last year, none of those kids who were in that program reoffended. So we do believe very strongly that diversion works. But it's all about accountability. It's all about making sure that kids actually have an incentive to complete the program, which is why I think some of the issues have come up around technical violations of probation, because in those cases, kids who have been ordered to certain treatment, who have not completed the treatment, there are issues there with accountability, and one of the things, and one of the requirements that judges often order, probably in every case, is that the kid attends school. And what we have noticed is that a lot of our kids are not in school. And I know you all will be getting a briefing around truancy. I can tell you that anecdotally, the vast majority of those kids who have been charged by my office for the most violent offenses have atrocious attendance records. And so we know that when kids are not in school, when they're not learning, when they don't see a clear path to the future, that they're more likely to engage in risky behavior. So intervention does work if it is ordered and if there is accountability for compliance.
Okay. The secretary, he mentioned about some of the numbers in crime not being as high in terms of juveniles from a larger scale, but I'm hearing a lot of conversations in the community about youth crime. When I speak to our police chief, they seem to think those numbers are different. And so with that increase in youth crime, why do you think the numbers are so low for these the diversion programs? That's not a huge number of folks participating.
So the kids who we get referred cases for are the kids who are committing the violent or the felony offenses.
Mm-hmm.
So what I believe is that overall there has been a decrease in youth being arrested or detained for less serious offenses. But there clearly has been an increase in arrests for carjackings, for gun offenses, robberies. I mean, that's clear. I don't think anyone can say that that's not true. That happened. So I think when we look overall and see those larger numbers that would include a variety of offenses, and yes, overall, I agree that youth who have been arrested for certain types of offenses are down, but when you see these more concerning categories, at least concerning for us and our victims, especially the cases that are involving gun offenses, that is a serious problem. And we have seen significant increases in those types of offenses.
Okay, so that leads me to my next question. In terms of felony offenders not having the ability to go through the diversion programs. So when those things happen, like the carjackings, the armed robbery, which, a lot of our joint constituents are extremely concerned about these problems. A lot of folks are scared to even go to the gas station. It's an extremely concerning issue. What's happening to those offenders? Because you hear, I don't know how true it is, because I'm not there at the courts, monitoring, but the release of, constant offenders for carjacking, the release of constant offenders for armed robbery, Why is that taking place, and what can we do to change that? You know, because I don't think anybody wants to see a carjacker running around the streets or armed robbers.
Yeah, and the last people want to see that is us, trust me, because we deal with everybody. But when a youth is arrested, they are taken to our local Department of Juvenile Services. And an intake officer, from what I understand, will determine whether or not that young person will be released at that point. Whether or not their case would be informal, whether or not they're going to continue to review the case for potential petition to our office. To the state attorney's office.
Juvenile puts a gun in somebody's face, threatens to kill them to get out of the vehicle, and they take the car, they get arrested, and they can potentially be released by somebody at the office.
I don't believe that happens under that fact pattern. I don't believe that the intake officer at the Department of Juvenile Services would do that. That's my belief. I don't believe that they would. But there are cases, let's say if kids have committed other types of offenses, let's say they're in a carjacked car. But based on the information that the police have, they can't necessarily prove that those are the kids who carjacked the car. So they may be charged with auto theft, they may be charged with unauthorized use of a vehicle, they may be charged with something else. Those kids may be released. But DJs can kind of tell you a little bit more about their policy. But I think for the nonviolent offenses, that they can be released at that point. Generally, what happens if it's a more serious offense is they're detained, and on the next judicial day, they go before a judge, and our office, along with the public defender or defense counsel, along with DJS, will make representations to the court about what the status of that individual should be. And there's criteria that the court has to consider. And I think one of them is sort of like this idea of a least restrictive environment. And so that comes into play when the court is analyzing what the status of that young person should be. Okay. But ultimately, either a DJS intake officer or a judge will determine whether or not a kid will be released.
Okay. Mr. Chair, is it appropriate if I ask DJS to come up to answer to that question?
Yes, sir. So you were asking about carjackings?
Yeah, particularly carjackings, armed robberies, some of the egregious cases I'm constantly hearing from my constituents. In that particular instance, what happens? Because what the state's attorney mentioned, if they are arrested, they go directly to your intake officer and they can make the decision, or the judge can make a decision. Is that what's happening with your intake officers? Are they releasing someone who carjacked someone back into the streets?
So there's two different, when I was listening to you, I heard two different strains of question there. One was release, detain. The other is formal, informal. So let me answer it two different ways.
I have no idea what any of that means. Do they get out? Do they get back to the streets, or do they stay in jail?
So that's release, detain. So the law says we can release them, but our policy says we do not release them on a gun crime or a class 1 felony, which are the more serious felonies. So that's a double right there on a carjacking.
Okay.
On formal, informal, because that's the way the question was being discussed, we must forward that case to the prosecutors. We can't divert that kid. You know what I mean by divert? We can't just not send them to court. They gotta go to the prosecutor.
Because it seems to be one of the topics of discussion constantly in the community. These kids are coming back out. They carjacked and they go back out into the streets. And it's repeat offender after repeat offender after repeat offender. Right. And it's the same kids being arrested for the same crimes. So somebody's releasing those children or those offenders, those children who happen to be offenders, back to the streets. Right. So how is that happening?
Sure.
And what can we do to stop that? Because that's what the community is more concerned about.
Sure. So many points along the way, different people have different decision-making authority. Police arrest, and they can ask us to detain or not ask us to detain. And that is up to the law enforcement in different parts of the state as to what approach they want to take. Kid gets sent to us, we can detain or release. Our policies on who we release are, we don't release gun cases, we don't release the most violent cases, we don't release kids who are high risk. But that's only till the next court day. Then the judge sees them and makes an independent decision as to what they want to do. Release, detain, release with an alternative.
Okay.
And then prosecutors get the case. Sometimes there's not enough evidence to prove the case, so they don't go forward. You catch a kid in a car, did they carjack that car, or were they just sitting in that car? I asked the prosecutors about stuff like that. I don't know how they figure that out, but a not inconsiderable portion of carjacking cases, for example, get dismissed. So that's not because prosecutors are soft on crime. I'm sure there's a million reasons why that happens, and you just got to ask them. So part of the reason I gave you the data is because it kind of matters, but you never hear about the 92% of the cases that work, or the 85%, depending on what we're talking about here. The only ones you and the prosecutors and the police hear about are when things don't work out. And then unfortunately, in the atmosphere we're in, there's a lot of stress. And so people start to say, who's to blame here rather than how do we fix it? I'm glad we're having hearings because this is a how do we fix it moment. And I get to explain all that stuff. And I'm not saying we're blameless. We screw up sometimes, but you've got more insight into what I do than any other point in the system. Who else gives you a data book that's this thick? Who else has a JJMU looking in their facilities? Nobody else in the system has that. And I'm open to more scrutiny. I got no problem with that.
Okay. And that's why I asked the questions to the state's attorney and to you as well. Where do we come in to be helpful with this particular issue? But I'm done with my questions, Mr. Chair, and I can pass on to the next.
Yes, I mean, that's what one of the things that I want to say that is it's at least you get in trouble when you don't agree on what the actual end goal is. And we all, both sides of the aisle, everyone here wants it. We all have the same goals, and everyone here has the same goal. And so that is very, very, encouraging. And that's why we have this forum. So you could have a deep dive conversation. So take your time, ask your questions. Mr. Secretary, looking to give that justice monitoring unit more ability to work with you. I'll say it that way.
Mr. Chair, may I just answer in terms of, the Secretary was asked a practice question, and as it applies to the law, and I would be remiss if I did not provide clarity as to what the law is. So Senator Charles, in your example, if that individual was a 16-year-old charged with a carjacking, they would automatically be charged as an adult and brought into the adult system. So that would be out of the purview of DJS. So I wanted that to be clarified. Also, the Secretary was asked another legal question in regards to probation. And what also must be clarified as to the law as it exists now, misdemeanor can be extended to 1 year, a non-violent offense extended to 3 years. However, if we are talking about a crime of violence, probation under the current law can be extended to 21 years. So when we're talking about the time, it's important that we are all educated as to what is the current status of the law, especially when we're talking about probation. That is significant because the state's attorney from Montgomery County gave the example of not being able to provide services to an individual, for example, for drug treatment at 18 months. Well, if that individual, as we've often seen with children that are charged with drug offense, for example, possession with intent to distribute, they are essentially selling to support their own habit. Under the current law, they could be supervised for up to 3 years. So therefore, that would cover the 18 months that they would be able to get drug treatment and whatever additional services. I just want to make sure that as we're speaking, we're all clear as to what the current law is. And I would also highlight.
All right, just one second, just because just, we got to reestablish some ground rules. Generally, it's, the members will prompt the questioning and then we will have the respondents come up and ask. So you got that one past me, so we'll let it leave. So go ahead and finish up, and then I'm going to give the state's attorneys equal time to respond if they like. But just again, the questions are prompted by the members, and then responses come forward. We'll do it that way. But this was very good information. So
Yes, I just do not
typo
want
on it,
us
and then
to
we'll move on to the next.
continue the discussion with the inaccurate law. So I just wanted to clarify what the current status of the law is.
No, respect and appreciate that. Thank you. I just want to make sure equal time each side, balanced discussion. So. Okay.
All right, briefly, I will respond on behalf of the state's attorneys. Rich Gibson, on behalf of the state attorneys, President of Maryland MSAA, State Attorney for Howard County. So as to the timelines, I want to make sure that we're all clear as to the timelines, because we discussed that for misdemeanors, right? Misdemeanor offense. The initial maximum sentence is 6 months, okay? It can be sentenced in 3-month intervals up to a year for misdemeanor offenses. For felony offenses, the initial maximum sentence, the maximum that the court could deem appropriate is 1 year. And if there's a showing by clear and convincing evidence for extension, it can be sent up to 3 years. Now, in terms of the issue with the clock running out and time, anecdotal example from Howard County, we had a female respondent who was driving under the influence. She got into an accident which caused injuries, right? She was put on probation. Drugs were a part of her problem. She was put on drug treatment. She never successfully completed drug treatment during the period of time she was on probation. She consistently tested positive for CDS the entire time she was there. Never paid restitution to the family that was harmed when she got in the accident with them. They maxed the time out they could for the offense. And the period ended. And that's that. She's now out in the community, hopefully won't crash into anyone we care about or anyone in our community, right? The odds of her getting another accident or potentially seriously injuring someone are no less than when she began her interaction with the justice system. And so are we safer? Is she better off? Have we helped her? The answer to those things is no, no, and no. And that's the problem we're facing today. And we're here again to find solutions.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Senator Delaney James, you are up next if you still have a question. Take your time. Thank you. Thank you for being patient.
That's okay. My last name is James, like that building, so I just really want to be called my name. I wasn't here for any of the bills that were passed, so I don't want to make this hearing any longer. So what I was just hoping is if, for the example, the secretary, I assume you're tracking all this information. Yeah, sure. Yeah. I assume you're tracking all the information you're being asked about, diversions, so all I'd like to know is, do you have a report I can read that covers everything we're talking about today? Is that available for me to read?
Yeah,
I can read that and then I'll ask you a question
Sure.
and follow.
I'll answer that 2 different ways. One is we have a very thick data book that just came out. I will put that in your office.
Well-
The other is there's a couple of questions that were asked that
No.
aren't in that data book that I will send.
You
to
can
the-
get, I'm a trial lawyer. You can really bury a lot of information in overwhelming data, so I would like it to be the kind of report that when I read and ask a question about when somebody gets diverted, are they getting the services they need, or are they, or is the time running out? Whether arrests are going up or down and what's the nature of those arrests. So I'm happy to get the underlying data, but I would like a sort of a summary.
Great.
And hopefully you're, because you want this program to succeed too, right? So I would assume that you want to track it and show that it is indeed succeeding over time.
Great.
Okay. And then the same for the state's attorneys. You all had some terrifically concise suggestions and problems, really, and very compelling testimony from, I think, from Wycomico County. I tried to take some notes on it, and I think you're the only group that didn't provide any kind of written information. So again, I'm hearing the problems, but I can't put them in context. I know everybody's busy, but it would really be helpful for as a new legislator. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator James. So now he's gonna provide it for us, so we'll get it. Senator Sidnor.
Thank you very much. I wanted to echo Senator James's request to the state's attorneys. I mean, I've spent the entire interim watching many of you on television, talking very anecdotally. And it's been extremely frustrating. And I'm glad we're back in session because now I can talk to some of this frustration that I've had when I've heard state's attorneys talking on television about the legislation that we passed. I took some umbrage with it because when the legislation was passed, we were presented with a lot of information, plenty of data, and we didn't make the decisions that we made in a vacuum. However, you all come before us today with just anecdotes again. The Department of Juvenile Services provided information. The Office of Public Defender provided information. This summer, well, actually this fall, in Baltimore County, we had an opportunity to speak with our law enforcement and they provided data. And one of the things in the data that we were looking at as we talked with our police department was there was a breakdown in how juvenile offenses were categorized. So on television, we heard much about how the Juvenile Justice Reform Act has caused all sorts of problems because now juveniles, there's no accountability. But the Juvenile Justice Reform Act, what it did was it said that children under 13 were the ones that weren't going to be incarcerated. So what Baltimore County did, and during our presentation, there was some breakdown in information. And this is certainly directed for Mr. Kroll. When you provide that information, I would love to see a breakdown in the juveniles who are under 13 and those above 13 so that we can really see how our law supposedly, according to you all, has created this problem that we're having with juvenile crime. So that's number one. Number two, for our state's attorney out of Howard County, I'm curious, you were talking about technical violations and those issues. I know a number of years ago, when we did some other reform, we were trying to get away from technical violations, but I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about these problems and how they're not being able to be addressed because of these technical violations.
Sure. So again, non-technical violations, substantive violations are committing a new crime, not following a stay away order, or absconding completely from supervision, just leaving the area without proper procedure. Everything else, any other violation you're looking at would fall under the category of technical violations, which is the majority of the violations that we would see.
Mm-hmm.
The example I gave moments ago is an example of a series of technical violations where the court could do nothing, the state could do nothing. This young lady was underage, she was high, she was driving a car, she got in an accident, she hurt somebody in our community.
Mm-hmm.
All right. She was put on probation and she was told, you must test clean. There's a drug problem here. Stay off drugs. You must pay restitution. You destroyed someone's car. They can't get to work now. They can't take care of their family needs now. That's a serious situation. You must make amends, right? She was told, well, that was primarily, it was restitution and stay clean. This individual never tested clean, but it wasn't a new crime to not test clean. She didn't abscond. She didn't just leave. She kept coming. She was never moving towards the better person that we all needed her to be, right? And as a result, the clock ran out. There was no repercussions, no consequence for just saying, nah, I'm not doing community service. I'm not doing drug treatment. Nah, I'm not paying restitution. There was no consequence to those things. The clock ran out. She's just back among us.
Now, and you can correct me if I'm wrong because this was a few years ago, but wasn't there some sort of a schedule that if there were multiple technical violations, there were consequences to that so that someone just couldn't have a bunch of technical violations?
So I literally had my prosecutors head of juvenile give me this case example this morning. I said, hey, this conversation is going to come up. Give me an example of a situation where we tried, the court was interested in doing something else, and the answer was nothing could be done. And this is the example that was provided to me. I obviously didn't handle the case myself. I'm relaying to you, my prosecutor works for me, head of juvenile.
Right, but I'm speaking to the law. Aren't there was there some sort of a step in consequences if if it kept being technical violations?
The answer is based upon this situation, no. I don't know if there are categories. I have to pull the law to say if there are categories of violations separate and distinct that would trigger a different response.
Okay.
I could tell you this is a case that happened in Howard County.
That's fine. Thank you. Two other questions. One, and not for you. Actually, you may be able to answer this. I know the state's attorney from Wacomico County spoke about folk preying on adults preying on juveniles, and I'm curious again. Plenty of anecdotal stuff that I've heard from listening to the news of adults taking advantage of or using juveniles, bless you, to commit crimes. And I'm curious, again, do you all have data that supports these statements that are being made about these adults who are misused? I mean, yeah, who are, in your terms, preying on these children?
So, Ms. State Attorney Dykes can answer that question.
Thank you. The reality is that we will never know that which we don't have the opportunity to know or ask. It is, how would we know that? So drug crimes routinely, right? Adult offenders are relying on children. I will tell you, I don't have stats as to that. I can see if our local police agencies do, but because juveniles can't question them, we will never know. And how else would we know?
And again, just to back up, you're saying you can't question them. The bill that we passed dealt with custodial interrogation, and I think you said there was
36
factors to determine whether or not something's a custodial interrogation. So if you have this juvenile and they're not in custody, but you may believe that I would assume that if an adult is using a child in that manner, that you could probably prosecute them for child abuse or something. So, I mean, if that child was a witness rather than someone who could be looked at as a defendant, you couldn't ask questions?
You could. What would the evidence we have? So prosecutors prosecute based upon evidence, and specifically admissible evidence. So what evidence would there be that that's happening?
That's what I'm asking you.
Let me. So you're asking to quantify a negative, right?
I'm saying that state's attorneys have gone on the news and they're talking about how adults are preying on children, and I'm just asking you to help me to understand.
So let me give you an example. And as State Attorney Dykes referenced earlier, the case I'm about to reference is an active case, so I'm going to be very careful with my wording and careful in my description. And as a disclaimer, the individual who is charged is presumed innocent until proven guilty, and all allegations must be proven by the state beyond a reasonable doubt. And this person is innocent right now.
Correct.
Right. Having said that, we had a situation in Howard County where a underage individual was overheard by another underage individual talking about trying to acquire a gun. Okay. And this was in a school setting. The one individual told their parents, I heard so-and-so talking about acquiring a gun. The parent called the school, all right? And the school went and interacted with that youth. And they stopped that youth and they talked to that youth. And that youth talked to them. And from that discussion, we learned, yes, he was trying to acquire a gun. He was trying to acquire a gun because he was selling drugs at the school, and the person he sold drugs to at the school didn't pay him his money, and he wanted to use the gun as a tool for solving said problem. Okay, that then led to a search warrant being drafted. They search this individual's home. They find a plethora of drugs that were being sold at the school and another gun that he had at home. Okay, the police, the information that the school had that they were able to interact with that student on, that discussion that where he was asking incriminating statements of that student, the school has authority and power to engage in a way that our police do not under the current law. So the police couldn't ask those questions because those questions, they would have stopped the young person. The person would have been free to leave. That's one of the variables that are counted for whether someone is a custodial conversation or not. They were asking questions that would be incriminating of nature. The responses were incriminating to the young. None of that mattered because it was school, not police. But if it was police asking the same thing, performing the same function, keeping us safe, keeping our school safe, keeping our kids safe, they couldn't do it under the current law. Again, you can't count a negative, but in an example like that, we would want as a society that the police to have those powers to keep us all safe, to keep our children safe. They currently do not.
And I'm not gonna debate. I mean, we do have a Fourth Amendment and the like, and so I'm not gonna get into that. But again, the question, going back to my question, is about adults preying on children.
You got it.
Evidence of an accomplice or co-conspiracy, right? Like that doesn't happen without a statement. That doesn't happen without evidence.
But why frame it that way? I guess is what I mean, you're talking about a co-conspiracy. To me, I'm hearing child abuse. You frame it that way, it's a different type of frame, right?
Child abuse requires an injury. So physical child abuse requires an injury. Sexual child abuse requires exploitation. So it's an accomplice theory. It's a co-conspiracy. It's not child abuse.
So
what I will say is that I think we can kind of look at prior to this law going into effect, what was our experience and why I think we should be very concerned about not being able to get information from children. So as you know, depending on the age of a child, that child will either be originally charged as an adult for certain types of offenses, any offense carrying a life sentence. If the child is at least 14 years old, they'll be charged originally as an adult. If it's a crime of violence and certain felonies, at 16, they'll be charged as an adult. And when they're charged as an adult, they're originally housed in adult facilities. Now, in Prince George's County, as with maybe some other jurisdictions, I can't speak to other jurisdictions, we do often support those young people, even if they're charged as adults, to be housed in a juvenile facility so that they can receive education and other services that they may need while they're awaiting their trial for the more serious offenses. But I say all that to say that we want to know what their role was in the offense relatively early so that we can determine whether or not we may want to support a petition for them to be waived to juvenile court, depending on their culpability, their role in the offense, or if we are going to recommend that they remain in the adult system because we don't think that there are services that could support their rehabilitation. But all of that information, we kind of would receive through conversations before this law went into effect. We would see through conversations with our younger offenders. We would know pretty early on in the process whether or not we're dealing with someone who is organizing crimes with other kids, or if they are being influenced by older people. And I can tell you that kids typically don't find guns on their own. Many of the carjacking offenses, what we know, and we'll try to get you as much data as you require. Our understanding is that our panel did not have the ability to do a presentation, and that's why we did not have a presentation as the other panels did, but we will certainly provide that. But
That's not true, but
I'm
keep
just
going.
saying that's what we were advised, but
that's not what I advised. But
Okay,
I'll put
that's
it-
what we were.
Okay, that's not what I advised, just for the record.
Okay, I understand. That's fine.
But the thing, but this is the
If I
point
could
though.
just finish my response.
But-
Um,
But I
that
do want to
those- that
stay
those-
on what we're
that those,
talking about though.
Vehicles that are stolen often by young people, carjacked often by young people, find themselves in the hands of others, often committing further crimes with those same
Alright.
vehicles. So what we know is that there is
But
a
again,
level
I
of
want to get back to, I
organization.
want to get back to my line of
Okay.
questioning.
Okay.
And the public defenders, one of their slides, if we're talking about interrogation of children, you all said that I guess the world was much better prior to this bill or this law going into effect. Their data says that youth were three times more likely to falsely confess than adults. 36% of those exonerated for crimes were convicted, while children and 86% of those exonerated for crimes allegedly committed before they turned 14 had falsely confessed. How is that a useful tool? I mean, what prophylactic measures were you all using before we took away this ability to interrogate like you were in the past?
So I'm really not sure where that data is coming from. It may
The
be
behavioral
national
science
data.
and the law
It may
and
be national
Northwestern
data,
School
it
of
may
Law.
be national. I cannot speak to exactly where that came from, but what I can speak to is what we have seen. We are not talking about false confessions. We're not talking about individuals who had absolutely nothing to do with an offense. We're talking about people who were involved in an offense. And the question for us is why?
What type of
Who
prophylactic
encouraged
measures were
you?
you all
Say it again?
using to ensure? I said, what type
Well,
of prophylactic measures were you all using?
So the police question suspects and witnesses in all types of crimes. So it's when you make that statement, I feel like you have already chosen almost like a side, or you believe that whatever the police are doing is wrong. They're trying to get information so that they can protect the public and they can find out what happened.
What I
What
believe is
And-
that children, and it's proven, children tend to believe adults. And I remember, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, questioning a state's attorney about the ability for law enforcement to lie in interrogations. And I said, would you like to take away that ability of your lying to children? Because children will believe what an adult in authority tends to say. Generally, they're going to believe you. So there are certain things that happen in these custodial interrogations that even adults fall prey to. So when you have children who are then being lied to and say, you know what, just tell us X and you get to go home to mama, and they say X, all right, now you're not going home to mama because you just confessed.
Okay.
So again, what I'm saying,
Just real.
what I am saying.
Hey, just one second. All right. A couple things. We had a series of pre-meetings before all these briefings, and half the people on this panel were on that briefing where it said, hey, you had multimedia capability, you could submit whatever you needed for the committee to consider, slide decks, whatever. So that's one thing. Second is, really directed the comments to steer away from this subject matter because, we really wanted to talk about the system, absent this, and the points of failure and solutions that we can move forward on. Both sides concluded it, and so here we are talking about it with 10 minutes to go. So we can extend this conversation on. We can keep it going. If you think this information is fruitful, fine.
I only
but
want to correct.
I
one
understand that, but I
Yeah,
just
there's a
want
public
to cool things off for a second. Let's go ahead, Mr. Gibson, go ahead and we'll move
I will
on.
be the most concise a lawyer's ever been in the history of lawyers. So a promise such as that, right, would undermine the veracity of the statement, and therefore the attorney would not likely be able to use that in court. All right, so you can't promise someone something like that. You can lie to a person. If you touch this machine, it's going to tell you whether you're lying or not. It's just a shoebox. You can do that, but you cannot promise someone something, right, that undermines the veracity of the statement. That would be an element the defense counsel could raise in court that would undermine the admissibility of said statement. And that's as concise as I can be as it relates to the final point that Senator Sidnor raised.
One last question.
Yeah, go ahead.
And this is for the Office of Public Defenders. And talking about these false confessions in your slide, I'm just curious, any idea on the amount that these who have falsely confessed and then been prosecuted cost the state? In terms of obviously if they've been prosecuted, incarcerated, so forth, because of these types of false confessions, do y'all keep any information like that on the cost?
We do not keep the information cost. However, recently the state of Maryland paid the gentleman in Baltimore who as youth had falsely confessed, and I don't remember the dollar figure that the Maryland Department of Public Works paid those three individuals in terms of millions. That was directly associated with the fact that as children, they had made false confessions and then were in jail for significant, excuse me. So that was a cost of $48 million to compensate the Baltimore three. In October of 2023, the city of Baltimore agreed to pay three men, Alfred Chestnut, Andrew Stewart, and Ransom Watkins, a total of $48 million to compensate them for their combined 108 years that they had been unjustly imprisoned on charges brought against them as teenagers. And part of that was as a result of false confessions that had been contributed in regards to the prosecution of that particular case. I would like the opportunity to address the SIPA points, as the Office of the Public Defender is the agency that is solely responsible in terms of the hotline that we are talking about. What occur, and essentially to clarify, if the police seek to question a witness, they can do so. SIPA does not preclude it. The only instances when a child is under custodial interrogation. However, what is also important to note that has not been part of this discussion is that there exists in the current law a public safety exception. So in any of the examples that the state's attorneys mentioned, if they determined there was a situation in the school where there was a gun and they needed to react immediately, that falls under a public safety exception, regardless in the school or out of the school, where law enforcement could in fact speak to the child. It is important that we speak in terms of these discussions as to what the current law is and speak factually accurately. There are exceptions that exist to public safety. So when we talk about the inability to question children, it is not, the issue is not because we are trying to protect their constitutional rights. If we want to talk about solutions, let us discuss solutions in the process. So we have heard several examples today about officers are on the street and they make an arrest and they call DJS. The reality is that that is not the only person whom they can call. The prosecutors here will tell you, and I will also speak in terms of my years of practice. I have been a public defender for 27 years and handled numerous homicide cases, for example. When a homicide takes place on the street, the officer will call the state's attorney's office. And more often than not, a state's attorney will be out at that scene. A solution in this, if there is a situation, for example, an example was given, it's 2:00 in the morning, and there's question about whether or not DJS is responsive, the option is to call the state's attorney's office. If we have issues in terms of investigation, the solution is better training or law enforcement. A case cannot rise and fall upon the questioning of a 14-year-old. There's some insanity in that the strength of an investigation is based upon the ability to question a 14-year-old. The solution is in regards to education and better investigative tools. I cannot emphasize that enough, that we're talking about solutions. The accountability cannot only be bared upon the children that we are to serve. That cannot be where the accountability is. If we're talking about swift and certain, it must be swift and certain that the shareholders must also be responsive.
All right, thank you very much. Again, I informed both sides not to address this issue, and it's devolved here now. We're not even going to take it up this session, but thanks for wasting 15 minutes of time. Anyway, all right, Senator West, and then we'll go on to Senator Folden, and actually Senator Muse, did you have a question before?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, if we're breaking it for, I've got a number of questions. So we just don't have time this afternoon to get into it. I wanted to converse with Mr. Schiraldi. So maybe you could come to my office at some time where we could have a conversation rather than do it here in public. Would that be preferable?
Look, I think if you're talking about DJS, that is the purpose of this, you know, and the systems that are in play here with this, that's the purpose of this briefing. So I'll indulge you. Like, let's go ahead and get some of those out.
All right, well, let me start with my questions.
Then we're going to move on to Senator Folden, and I know Senator Carter has some questions. So,
okay, Mr. Schiraldi, let me ask you a couple of questions. So you're the first to admit, are you not, that the system is not perfect?
Yes, absolutely.
And there's always room for improvement.
Yes.
And there are a number of bills that have been introduced this year that we will address sequentially as the year goes on. And it would be very helpful if you were able to attend those hearings or have a representative attend and give your department's take on it.
Absolutely.
During the prior administration, the administration basically didn't comment on bills, didn't take positions on bills. I would love it if this administration would take positions on some of the bills that are going to come before this committee.
Yeah, every Friday we go over a list of bills that pertain to us. Some of them, like the interrogation stuff, that's not us, but the other stuff that pertains directly to us, you will be hearing from us.
And let me just say parenthetically that I was on that Juvenile Justice Reform Act Commission. And I totally agree with the fundamental decision of the commission, which is that it's far better to anticipate these problems as soon as they crop up and give juvenile services to turn their lives around rather than let the problems fester until they result in serious crimes later on in the juvenile's life. So the concern, I think, some of the concerns you've heard expressed from the state's attorneys here is that there are elements of what we did a couple of years ago that are counterproductive. For example, Mr. Gibson talked about arbitrary time constraints on probation, time constraints on technical violations. And he said a helpful solution would be to remove the time limitations and instead focus on reform metrics on an individual basis. Do you agree generally with that approach? Or do you think we still should stick with the arbitrary time constraints on probation and technical violations?
So a couple of things. One is the Juvenile Justice Reform Council occurred before I got here, but I was very impressed by the work you all did on that. There was bipartisan prosecutors, defense attorneys, police, Republicans, Democrats, lots of data, took a couple of years, came out with a bunch of recommendations that were not outrageous. There's some states where kids under the age of 12 or 13 can't be prosecuted for anything. California being an example of that, Massachusetts. You didn't go that far. You struck a balance, I thought. There is no perfect answer to this question. We keep sort of, and you see, like, we're all pulling the most extreme examples. I don't know, Senator Sidnor was talking about how there's a lot of idiosyncratic discussion here. And, you know, we see a kid and a 5-year-old in handcuffs, and then we hear about a girl with a drug problem that no one can do anything about, right? My suspicion, and you were all, 3 of you were on that panel, is that the reason you curbed the ability for kids to be on probation for longer periods of time for misdemeanors, but still allowed courts to extend it, and the reason you curbed my department's ability to technically violate kids and judges' ability to technically violate kids is because you felt that there were abuses in that regard. And nationally, there were abuses in that regard. I don't really know what Maryland was doing, but I know generally speaking, there are.
But maybe now we're
Could you
finding
guys
that
tweak
if
it?
you put an arbitrary time limit on it, there are
All time
problems
limits
with
are
that
arbitrary
too.
though, right? Every penal code section has a time limit on it. There's no perfect number. So you are always setting time limits in the penal code and in the instructions you give us. So they're all somewhat arbitrary, but whether this is the perfect one or not, I'm open to that discussion. I was having that discussion with Ivan Bates Friday about this
Right.
very issue. So I'm not saying scorched earth. No, I'm not going to die on different hills. I'm willing to talk to you
I
guys.
think we all welcome dialogue.
Yep.
Because through dialogue, we'll arrive at a solution which hopefully will make things better.
Right.
Ms. Rosenblatt suggested a proposed 24-hour mandatory hold. She said that DGS currently is releasing juveniles too quickly before the state's attorney is involved. And a 24-hour hold would allow the state's attorney's office to take a look at these cases before the hold is released. What do you think about that?
So every time if by hold, you mean detention?
Yeah,
or
overnight.
So
overnight
if
detention
you-
until the next judicial.
Yeah,
day.
overnight detention has an impact on kids. So before we do it, we need to assess both parts of that, right? For every kid that we didn't hold that went out and reoffended, there's going to be 9 kids, literally, because it's about a 90% non-reoffense rate that we might have to hold that shouldn't have been there. And then we're going to be spending money. And also when a less serious kid is detained in a facility with more serious kids, the less serious kid doesn't make the more serious kids better. The opposite happens. So I just want you to weigh both sides of it. That's all I'm saying.
Fully understand, and that's why we need the
Yep.
dialogue. I'll finish with one final question. That's this Juvenile Interrogation Act.
boy.
The defense say that. Oh, we're not going to talk about that? Okay, I'm sorry.
Also, that's not me anyway. I'm not the
We'll cover that,
interrogation guy.
but I would love to talk with you in my office sometime at your.
Absolutely.
convenience.
I'll
Thank you.
for sure.
I'm good.
Thank you. I promised to be brief and I wouldn't even ask this, but I wasn't able to get to Mr. Gibson when he was up. And I think, Mr. Gibson, if you don't mind coming up, I promise to be brief. So one of the things that has been most frustrating, and many of us have talked about it, is the misinformation that's been put out about the actual law and the difference between any actual flaw in the law versus potential holes in the system. And so I think it's really important that we're accurate with the information that we give. And so my understanding is that you said when you were up here that there was a maximum potential probation period for felonies in the juvenile system of 2 years, correct?
3 years, ma'am. It's not, well, it's 1 year. And then there are set intervals. It can be moved on to, if there's a hearing and the hearing decides that it's in the best interest of the child to a clear and convincing level, then it can be extended up to 3 years.
But in
Felonies.
those most serious cases, isn't it true that that probation would likely succeed a period of detention in a secured facility? So the child could be actually placed into a secured facility following a finding of delinquency. And then once
I'm sorry.
released, the period of probation would kick in.
Senator Carter, could you just rephrase?
It's not
that
as
for me?
if the only solution for a bad crime is probation. There's actually the alternative of detention. So I just want to make it clear that we're not, the law does not say that there's only a 3-year potential probation for a serious crime that would be a felony. It actually says that is the suggested time, but it could be following a period of detention. So in the worst crimes, they're going to be likely detained in a secured facility, particularly if it's not their first offense. Is that would you say it's accurate?
The majority of in Howard County, I'll speak to Howard County specifically, 90% of the kids that we see, 90% of our respondents, 90%, the overwhelming majority are handled in the community. So they are not detained. They're not held. They're not in a secured facility locked away. They are receiving treatment.
You're
YAP
talking
program.
post adjudication, correct?
Yeah. So the court says, I find this child, there's a hearing. Child says, I didn't do it. Prosecutor state says they did. There's a trial that occurs. Witnesses are called, things of that nature. A magistrate or a judge hears that information and then makes a ruling based upon the evidence and finds either the child was involved in the criminal act called fact sustained or was not involved, in which they're the equivalent of acquitted, and they are free to go like anyone else. Assuming they're fact sustained, the court then has the ability to attach consequences to that action. 90% of the time in Howard County that we're attaching consequences, that child is dealt with in the community. They're not put in a secured facility behind a wall somewhere.
But that's not the law that prevents that.
No, I'm just telling you what the numbers are. This is what we're seeing in real practice. We're seeing.
But are you arguing for secured facility and the court is saying no?
No.
You're not even, you're not making an effort to have a child.
I agree with a lot of what Public Defender Darty said. Like, prosecutors aren't clamoring to lock people up. We're trying to solve problems. Sometimes the solution requires we lock you up, and then we advocate for locking you up. If, on the other hand, we can solve the problem with a lighter touch, but it still addresses the underlying root cause issues, we're all for that.
So you gave one scenario. I promise to be brief. I don't want to hold up. Everybody wants to go. But this is kind of like my colleague across the aisle, Senator Folden, who, I'll try to put a question to it, but what you raised, the one example you gave of how potentially a probation for a misdemeanor offense was not long enough, appeared to deal with a person that was addicted to drugs. And so what we all know is that when someone is addicted to drugs, their treatment needs, that's why in adult system, we have drug treatment court, because often those people are gonna not stop using drugs or recidivate. And so my question to you, and I kind of know the answer, so it's a comment and then it isn't so, in the juvenile system, there is no opportunity for someone that's actually just completely addicted to have that treatment facility, that intake in a treatment facility. Is that correct? Had she been able to get her treatment needs met, it's quite likely she wouldn't have violated, because the issue appeared to be she was just on drugs.
No. So there's outpatient drug treatment and there's inpatient secure drug treatment facility. In Maryland, as Secretary Ciraldi said, we have no secure inpatient drug treatment facility for our youth.
That's what I was saying.
But we have outpatient, like I said, 90% of the cases in Howard County are handled in the community. We do have outpatient drug treatment. This young person was told, you are to go to outpatient drug treatment. And this young person took it upon themselves to say, nah, no, thank you.
I understand. It's just that my point is that's why we know that we deal with addiction differently in adult court. We have a drug treatment court because we anticipate that people that are addicted to drugs may not conform with the law. They may not go. That's why we offer them the opportunity to go into a secured treatment facility.
So drug treatment court, just to be clear, is outpatient, generally speaking, not inpatient.
But they have the option to be put into a facility, a treatment facility is my point.
Yes, if they violate, court could order that.
So that's what I'm trying to,
Can't do that in
that's the
juvenile.
point.
We agree. Yes,
Exactly.
excellent, we agree.
Exactly. Thank you.
Yep.
Chairman, for you, if I can just build upon what you said, and I've listened to you say over and over again, she said, nah, I'm not going.
Yes, sir.
Who was responsible for accountability and who was responsible for pushing the issue to make sure that what they told her to do, she did? Why did it take? In fact, she went all the way until there was no more time involved to push her to do it. But who was responsible for that not happening?
So several things. One, we cannot absolve people of their own agency. So the choices you make, you are responsible for. We've put in place conditions for you to follow, and we're asking you to engage in this.
So there were conditions that were not mandatory. No, a court did not say you have to do this.
No, the court ordered it.
The court ordered it.
Yes.
But the court ordered it.
Yes.
How did she get away with not going at all and not doing anything?
So again, You're absolutely touching on the problem. The
Okay,
problem is
what's
we
the
don't-
problem? Tell me the problem.
So people have agency over themselves and we can encourage you to make certain choices, but you have to make proper choices.
You
This
couldn't make her
individual
go.
Say again?
You could not make her.
could not make her
drive.
go. And we couldn't
Why
say,
is
well,
that?
you haven't gone, so the alternative is detention.
Okay, that's.
So we couldn't impose a sanction that would motivate her possibly to go, right? And so we're carrots and sticks in the end, right? And unfortunately, we didn't have the tools.
Okay, got you. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. There's no consequence. That's
No, appreciate it. Thank you very much. And I think actually this is a good subject matter to end on because I wanted to have a briefing on the substance abuse and mental health aspect of this, because I think that is the all critical component of I think our work this session. Unfortunately, we have way too many bills to have another briefing, so we will still address that issue, but it'll have to be done through bill hearings. I do want to say thank you all for our public defender, our state's attorneys, and for our secretary. You all have very important jobs and are very busy, and you shared a lot of your wisdom and time with us. Very appreciative. I think it will inform and instruct our decision-making going forward. And this information will be available to the public going forward. So it's a big public service. You spent your time here with us. So I really do appreciate it. And I want to say thank you on behalf of the committee. And for the committee members, this is great. The level and quality of questions is actually, I thought, very, very good. And I think it shows you all are engaged and ready to go for the 86 more days we've got going on here. But anyway, so with that, thank you all very much and have a good night.